Steve.
Hey, Ron.
Steve, hey, thanks so much for joining me this evening. Gosh, we've seen a lot of each other recently.
It just went out of my mind. I don't remember any of it at all.
You know what? That's probably just the ether talking. What I wanted to do this evening is I at least I had a good time doing our
Oh,
present
sure.
yeah, doing our presentation at Vintage Computer Festival Midwest. Um, Remind everybody, what did we do?
Well, we did a presentation about that collecting vintage Macintosh computers is for everyone. And this was at VCF Midwest 17, which took place in 2022. So don't let that 17 mess you up. That's just the 17th show they did. And it was a lot of fun. We had a good amount of people in the crowd. We did run a bit short on time, so there wasn't as much time to elaborate on some things that we would have liked to. So we're going to take that opportunity to stretch some things out and put some images or links in this recorded version to help you out getting started on your road to vintage Macintosh computing.
Right. And my understanding is they're going to put the original video out at some point in the future, but Steve was like, "Hey, like we should just do like kind of our own version so that way if we run a little long, we're not really under as much of a time constraint as we were the night of." You did another presentation that evening, which was really great to see you. So by the time we got up on stage, you were warmed up, you're firing all on all cylinders. So hopefully we can recapture some of that magic this evening.
I hope so. Yeah, it was a great show. The people put it on. It was fantastic, and they always do a great show. So if you want to find out more about VCF Midwest, the website is vcfmw.org, and we'll try and link this into the video that they upload of our original version, and we'll see if that works.
Yeah, that'll be awesome. Well, how about we get to it? Steve, why don't you bring up the slide deck?
All right, here we go.
Cool. All right. Kind of as we started it at the original thing, the purpose of this session was to talk about how collecting classic Macintosh computers is way more accessible than what you might suspect, and it's literally for everybody that's interested in this hobby. Um, Let me see if I can slide advance. Hey, I can. It all worked. So, who are we, Steve?
Well, I'm Steve from Mac84. You could follow me on Twitter and YouTube or go to mac84.net. I have a lot of repair guides there. Been a vintage Macintosh guy since before I could remember. I have a big collection of these machines. I fix them, I repair them, and I talk to a lot of people like Ron and others who are also enthusiastic about these systems and sort of gained a lot of knowledge about these things over the years. So I want to share it to everybody.
Very cool. My name is Ron McAdams. I am a Macintosh enthusiast from way back. As a kid, started out with Apple II computers and kind of moved on to the Macintosh when I got into high school, because that was kind of maybe the point when my school finally made the investment in some of those things. So I'm a big fan of the Apple IIe card and sort of some of that bridge technology that Apple was doing at that time. You can follow me at YouTube at Ron's computer videos. You can also find me on Twitter at Ron's Comp Vids, and there's a link tree down there that takes you to pretty much everything else I've got going on.
Awesome. And we're going to put all these links in the video description. So don't worry about trying to write them down or type them or anything. Well, they'll all be there.
Very cool. So let's talk about some of the goals for this presentation. What we want to try to do is give everybody the kind of the information and the confidence they need to get rolling in the hobby. We're going to try to break down Apple's product line so that way that you can see them by generation, like how collectible really are they, what you might expect to pay, other things you maybe want to look at when making your purchase. We're also going to have a section where we talk about repairs and must-have modern upgrades to just make things easier, because that does seem to be the stumbling block for a lot of people, because it's like, hey, I got my machine, but how do I get software on it? And
Yeah.
if you don't have the right tools, most of those machines just end up back in the attic somewhere. So, but um, in addition to sort of those basic tools that you need to kind of just get the machine going, it's leveraging the internet and these expert communities, so that way that you can talk to other enthusiasts and kind of build your own expertise. Then at the very end, we've actually solicited some online questions, so we'll try to cover that too. And when we did this presentation live, we did a giveaway where we gave away a Macintosh 7200 a LC, and then a really cool book that was called Building Your Own or Build Your Own Macintosh and Save or something along those lines. I just remember I picked that up when I was a kid and I just poured over it because it was kind of a neat idea of like you could somehow work a deal at the Apple repair shop and buy a board and put it in a PC case. It's mostly fantasy, but it really appealed to me as a kid.
Yeah, and that book is great. It's available on archive.org. There's a scanned copy, so we'll put a link in the description there. But I think what is great about the talk that we're doing is about 10 years ago, this talk would be very different. There are a lot of modern ways to get these machines up and running again. And I think one important thing you have to remember, just like the Atari systems or the Amiga systems out there, the Mac is different from a normal PC. It doesn't have a BIOS. There's a different way to boot up from things. There's a different way to create bootable hard disks and so on. So you have to sort of know these things. And we're going to be covering the basics of what machines to look at. And we'll probably do another talk about getting them up and running. And there's a lot of great resources that we'll provide as well to help you with that.
Absolutely. Just to kind of talk about what things are in scope for the presentation this evening. Macintosh computers that were produced from the original Macintosh 128, which came out in 1984, all the way kind of up to the era when the G3 iMac kind of came out. We're going to cover kind of what you think about as the beige and platinum kind of Macintosh computers. What isn't in scope? Machines that were made after that era. We're not going to really talk about Macintosh clone computers in this presentation, but that would be an amazing topic for a future one of these. We're not really going to talk about portable computers. We're not going to talk about PowerBooks or anything like that. That's kind of its own thing. Not going to talk about server products because even though there might have been like a workgroup server that mimicked the other, like a similar piece of Apple hardware, that's just kind of its own thing. And we're not going to really cover Mac-like things. So you think about like Apple Newton and stuff like that. So, but we're going to cover quite a bit of other things. So buckle up and enjoy. Steve, what should we expect?
Well, this list here is sort of like, hey, you have to be aware of some of these things before you dive in. And a lot of these apply to general computers of this era. But when you talk about the Mac, the biggest thing you see here is leaking capacitors, exploding batteries, etc. And you may have heard of this a lot if you're browsing the Facebook groups or learning about these machines for the first time. You might hear it on a YouTube video. And I have some notes I'm going to be referring to during this section because I want to make sure we get an understanding of what these things are so everybody's on the same page. So capacitors are components that help regulate the flow of electricity between areas of the board and other components. The capacitors we're mostly concerned about today are electrolytic capacitors. This can leak an electrolytic fluid, which is corrosive, and this can cause damage to components on the board, and it can eat away at traces on the logic board of your system. Now, we use the term recapping to explain the process of removing those old capacitors, cleaning things up, and replacing them with modern capacitors. But this may also require trace repair and other fixes to get the system working. So when you hear leaky caps or capacitors, that's generally what we're talking about. These capacitors exist on the motherboard, aka the logic board in the Mac world, or on a power supply, or on an analog board that drives the video circuitry on, let's say, a CRT. Now, Ron loves batteries, so I'm going to let him talk a little bit about batteries here.
Actually, at Vintage Computer Festival Midwest, somebody came up and razzed me about batteries, but I still think that your best bet, especially if you're going to not, this is going to be a daily driver machine or something for you, consider removing them, even if they are, you've put in a modern, safe replacement. But on the Macintosh, you think about like a PC world, they call it like a clock battery. On the Macintosh world, they call it a PRAM battery, parameter RAM. So it stores like your date and time, mouse settings. I think the status of a couple of different like serial port related things.
Yeah, if your system boots up in color, it might save that information.
Yeah, like how like bit depth. Yeah, sorry, that's a good one. But in the systems, when you buy them, if the battery is still in there from way back in the day, they are old and past their prime. These can leak and burst, and when they do, they often cause irreversible damage to your machine. So some of those early Macs have them soldered onto the logic board. So like You think about like a Macintosh SE and such, Macintosh II machines, um, or sometimes they have a socketed, or I'm sorry, a battery that actually goes into a holder, but they're kind of in obscure places. Like on the Quadra
Yeah.
700, it's actually underneath the drive carriage on the front of the machine. So looking inside, if you were to go out and try to, like, oh, I'm in the parking lot of Winn-Dixie, and they're like, oh yeah, pop the hood, take a look at whatever you want to see. Just looking in there, you may not see damage, but you get it home. Um, Even though the machine is very modular, you pull the power supply, it's one screw, the drive carriage pops out. Underneath there is your time bomb. So what you want to do is, if possible, if you're buying something and it's being sold to you as 100% fully working or restored in any kind of way, always check to make sure that the battery hasn't caused any kind of damage. You will be much happier if you take that extra 2 seconds. Now, if you're buying something that is being represented as, unknown condition, whatever, the pricing on that is probably going to be a lot cheaper than a known good or working machine. So, caveat emptor.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because a lot of these batteries were never serviced by an individual, and the reason being, some of these Macs, like the Macintosh Classic or Macintosh SE, did not have an easily removable battery. And so when you go to look at those machines, yes, you have to take away, 4 or 5 screws to get the back of the machine off, and the battery is on the logic board, and sometimes it's even soldered onto the logic board, like on some of the Macintosh SE systems. You have to just be careful and be aware that the battery could leak and corrode. And I'll put a picture up here when we put this together of just showing you the damage that could cause, because it is very severe. You just, can't even imagine what this stuff can do. It could rust the metal frame of the machine, and it can be something that you don't even know is happening until
Mhm.
you look inside. So if you have the opportunity to look in it physically, if you're in person, or ask the seller who has this if they could open it up and take pictures and send it to you. If they're selling something, they likely have a camera or a smartphone that they could send you pictures of. And if they're not willing to do that, maybe you pass on the machine, because an exploding battery is worse than capacitors in most situations, because the volume and area of damage that could cause is really severe. And it's something that you want to avoid at all costs. Because a battery bombed machine, which is a battery exploded machine, is usually not able to be saved, or at least not cheaply be able to be saved. Okay, so one thing I do want to touch on briefly is software. So the computer you're getting probably needs a copy of the Macintosh system software, which is the Macintosh OS, to get it up and running. Now, MacintoshGarden.org and Archive.org are just a few resources, to name a few, of where you could find a Macintosh operating system disk image or an original CD that you could burn, or applications and games. You do want to keep in mind the media that you're going to be using. So that goes to our next point about boot media. Because a Mac is a Mac, it does things a little bit differently. Macs will try and boot from a floppy disk, especially these beige systems that we're talking about today. And the earliest Macs don't have a hard drive. So the Macintosh 128K, the 512K, the 512KE, the Mac Plus, they do not have internal hard drives. So unless a serious upgrade was done to them, you're going to have to boot from a floppy disk. And so you may need to find the right media, like a floppy disk or a zip disk or a CD, to install the operating system. This may require having a second Mac that is in working order to help, get that other machine up and running. And you can use modern solutions like a Blue SCSI or a floppy MU, which we'll touch on a bit later. But you also have to know that Apple used SCSI as the interface for their hard drives way up until the later Power Macs, and this often led to faster disk performance back in the day, but it means that you can't really use an IDE or ATA drive like most PCs did. And so a modern replacement may be the best way to get a SCSI replacement there to boot off of, instead of risking buying an obsolete SCSI hard drive that is about 30 years old on eBay. You pay a premium for it and it doesn't work, or it's hard to get software on there, hard to format, etc.
I would really say, don't buy someone else's problem, like especially with hard drives. So, like a modern drive replacement solution is probably the way to go these days.
Yeah.
There's great options on the market. So, versus, because I've seen people go out on eBay and pay a premium price for that old quantum fireball, and they get it, and the drive, it's untested, the drive has stiction, and it basically just commits suicide the first time you turn it on. um,
Yep.
so very disheartening, and especially for people getting like into the hobby for the first time, you don't want to have situations like that where you just right out of the gate, it's like I spent a bunch of money and it just went nowhere. So yeah,
Yeah, we'll
definitely be
put a
careful.
link in the video description of where you could buy like a floppy boot disk. There are a few places that make a 400K or 800K boot disk for those Macs. But if you have a SCSI system like a Macintosh Plus or later, a blue SCSI for let's say about $50 or $60, depending on if it's shipped within the US or not,
Hmm.
um, that will get you going much faster than risking the same money on a questionable hard drive. You just need a micro SD card, drag and drop an image that you download, and you're away. You don't have to worry about formatting a disk really or configuration. A lot of setup is really saved for you. So it's well worth the extra few dollars you may save on finding a questionable SCSI hard drive than the time and effort that you have to may put into that, and
Yeah.
it may not work. So
Yeah. Something else people need to be concerned about is the brittle plastics of some of these machines. These are all injection molded cases on the original machines, the that are now 30 plus years old. And even some of the later ones that do have like a metal frame that then use plastic cases on top of, oftentimes they just use like pressure clips to kind of hold a case shut and things like that. So you absolutely just have to be careful when you're doing that. So really anything that was made during the mid to or the early to mid 90s, it can just be very, very fragile. It can shatter like glass depending on the conditions it's been stored in all these years. So probably the recommendation is, if you can avoid, there are certain machines that you absolutely just want to avoid having them shipped to you. So any of like the all-in-one machines, we'll talk about that a little bit later. So anything with a CRT inside of it, don't ship it. Go if you can get there in person, or you can figure out a way to meet halfway, beg of them to see if you could do that. um, some of those cases are just going to be missing some pieces of plastic, just due to handling, especially if things are coming out of the education market, which a lot of older Macs are. They might be missing faceplates, they might have other little bits of cosmetic damage, broken power buttons. There's I bought a machine a while back and everything was okay. I just stored it in my basement for a little while, regular humidity, nothing crazy. I pull it out and you hit the power button and you heard it explode inside the case. Um, didn't wasn't hammering on it or anything, but that's just the nature of things. So
yeah, that's something great to be aware of. But if you're not picky about the cosmetics of it, you might be able to score a deal if something is a bit beat up.
sure.
So the last thing we want to touch on before we get into the models of different Macs is about the keyboards and mice. These are the accessories that you need to use your Mac. They are proprietary. Apple made these. A lot of third-party manufacturers made them as well, but your standard PC mice and keyboards will not work on a Mac without a lot of adapters. So most vintage Macs that we're going to be talking about today use the Apple Desktop Bus, also known as ADB, and this will connect your keyboard or your mouse. You could daisy chain the keyboard and the mouse, which is nice. So you have one cable going to the back, and that goes to the keyboard. Then you have another cable that goes from the mouse to the keyboard. Some of the Macs had two ADB ports back in the day, but later on they just switched to one. However, the earliest Macs from 1984 through the Mac Plus in 1987 use a proprietary phone handset style connector. Now, the wiring is different. It's not exactly the same as your phone handset connector. We'll touch on that in a link in the comments or the video description, rather. But you will need to have a specific keyboard that works just for those systems. Those can be pretty hard to find and pretty expensive. Expect to pay upwards of $75 US for those keyboards. So if you're getting a Mac Plus or a 512K or a 128 and it does not have the keyboard, you could either build an adapter or buy an adapter or find a keyboard yourself, but you have to factor in that cost. The same goes for the mouse on those early Macs. It uses the same mouse as sort of like an Apple II would have. So there are a bit more out there than I'd say the keyboards. But again, it's not an ADB mouse. There's not going to be as many of them out there, and you're going to have to think about that. The other thing is with the Macintosh keyboard, the ADB keyboard, a lot of the Macs, let's say like the Color Classic or some of the all-in-one LC or Performa 500 series use something called soft power. And this means that the machine will not power on when you flick the switch on the back of the unit. You have to press the key on the keyboard to start the machine up. If you don't do that, the machine will act dead. Now, that could be an advantage if someone says, oh, I turned it on, it doesn't work, and they sell it to you cheap. And hey, the machine may work, but you need the keyboard to actually test that. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to power that on. And although we're not going to be talking about PowerBooks, there are some other things you have to be aware of for PowerBooks as far as proprietary cables, mostly power cables. But just want to touch on those things so you're well aware.
So we ask that was a lot of information to kind of absorb here at the top of the show. As we kind of go through, don't be afraid to pause the video, go out, look at things, do a little bit more research on your own. We'll be here when you get back. But we are asking that people that kind of come from that PC environment to maybe for the next few minutes, just think different with us. Steve, do you want to take this first slide?
Sure. So these are the early Macs. These are the first Macintosh computers that came out. The range here is from 84 to 87. And the 128K has, well, you guessed it, 128K of memory. These machines are pretty cool. The 128, the 512, the 512KE, and the Plus all share the same form factor. A few notes about these machines: they have black and white screens, so don't expect color. The batteries can actually be removed from the back. It's a different battery than some of the other Macs that we're going to be talking about later, but they can easily be removed. So it's very easy to just clip the little back of the door. Be careful, brittle plastics, etc. But you can remove that battery, and you can see if there's any corrosion that has made any issues on that machine. You usually see some green or white discharge if that's the case. The thing with these Macs is that you have to boot them from a floppy disk. So the 128, the 512, those models require a 400K floppy disk because they only have a 400K floppy disk drive. That's a single-sided disk. Now, there are some tricks you could do with PCs if you're really fancy and you have the right hardware, but 9 times out of 10, you're going to need an early Macintosh computer, let's say Macintosh II or a Power Mac or something, running the right version of the system software to actually write a 400K Mac boot disk. So if you don't have that, you can pay a few dollars online usually to get one, but you just have to be aware of that because there's a few caveats to trying to create these disks. You have to create them in a certain way so they are bootable. Now, the Mac 512KE and the Mac Plus are machines that have an 800K disk drive in them. So that's 800K floppy drive rather. And so they read 800K disks, which are double-sided. So again, you have to have a Mac create that boot disk, let's say a mid-90s Mac. Unfortunately, you cannot write 800K or 400K disks using a USB floppy drive, whether you're on a Mac or a PC. Just really, you can't do it without some caveats there. We mentioned this earlier, but remember that the Mac 128K, 512K, 512KE, and Plus models use a unique RJ11 phone handset style jack for their keyboards. These are not compatible with later ADB keyboards. While you can get adapters for these Macs to use a PS2 or ADB keyboard, if you pick up one of these systems and it doesn't include the keyboard, you'll need to get one or get an adapter. The mouse for these Macs also use a different connector than most Macs, but thankfully there does seem to be a bit more of them because the Apple II systems use the same mice. Some things to keep in mind: generally speaking, the logic boards, which is what we call motherboards in the Mac world, are okay on these machines. They generally do not need to be recapped. However, the analog boards usually do need recapping, or you have to look at the flyback transformer or other components on the board that may have failed. These things are getting up there in age, 35, 40 years old, so you have to be aware of what's going on. One thing that you'll probably find on most of these machines, which is usually called the REFA cap, and that's named after the company that made most of those components, is a filter capacitor. Now, this filters electricity. The machine can generally operate without it, but it can go boom, and it will release the magic white smoke. So you have to be careful when you're working on these machines. If you leave it plugged in, not even switched on, even if it's just plugged in and switched off, that capacitor could blow, and it's going to smell weird. It may blow the fuse in the system, may damage some other components. So if you're going to be using one of these systems, you're going to want to at least remove that capacitor or replace that capacitor. And there are plenty of links and places online to help you do that. Now, the analog board and the CRT contain high voltages. So if you are going to open up this machine, you have to learn how to maybe discharge the CRT. There's a link that we're going to share about that. But another tip here is when you're working on these systems, let's say you're testing out in a parking lot or someone plugs it into power and you're trying to see if this thing works. Well, on the bottom left of the system, right under the Apple logo, under the chin of the unit, there's a little brightness knob. Now, you can actually fiddle with that as soon as you turn it on. You wait a few seconds. If you don't see a picture, adjust that from one side to the other and do some extreme fiddling around with that. You might see an image, and that will give you an idea if it's working. Sometimes it's just turned all the way down or got displaced or something like that. But these CRTs are old. They may be weak. They may have burn in. So you just want to be aware of some of those things. But the 128K is a bit of a limited machine. The 512K you could do a bit more with. And the Mac Plus is something that you're going to probably want to aim for because it does have SCSI connectivity, which is great.
Yeah, I would definitely say that a 128, a 512K, or even the 512KE are really just kind of curiosities these days. They're not anything that you would really use. You'd probably put it on a shelf, or if you weren't building like a little Mac museum, you might want to include one in your collection. But the Plus definitely will do a lot of fun things. When you upgrade it to 4 MB of RAM, it's a great machine for System 608.
Yeah, no, that's great because these machines that we mentioned previously, which I forgot to mention, so thanks for reminding me, you can't upgrade the memory really in the 128, 512, or the 512KE. Yes, there were upgrades that people sold, but you as a user can't really do it. The Macintosh Plus is a machine that has 4 memory modules in there. So you could remove the memory, you could cut the little resistor and follow the manual that Apple has and actually upgrade that to 4 megs, which makes it a pretty usable machine. So the Macintosh XL is basically a Lisa 2 with a few upgrades done in there to run the Macintosh operating system. So it's on this list because it's technically a Mac. It was sold as a Mac during around the time Apple was trying to liquidate the Apple Lisas. We're not really covering that today. If you find one, get it no matter what the condition is. They are worth quite a bit because they are so hard to find. It has a proprietary keyboard. It can use a Macintosh mouse, but it's not going to be able to use the keyboard that these other Macs use. So, an interesting machine, but it's a whole other world as far as booting and servicing goes.
Yeah, absolutely. I know Shreve Systems was closing those babies out back in the day. They just one of them gone. And I know a lot of people bought them. Something else to think about with the 512 or the the Mac XL is it's since it's based on Lisa, it's a 5 MHz 68,000, and the Lisa displays use rectangular pixels, not square pixels. So Mac software on that machine looks weird.
Yeah, you could try out an emulator for yourself if you really want to see how that works.
Yeah,
But a curiosity, yes. And if you see a cheap, pick it up. You'll be sure to probably make your money back.
certainly. All right. So let's talk about the early Macintosh 2 computers. And the three in this series are the Mac 2, the Mac 2X, and the 2FX. What these kind of represent are the first color and modular machines that Apple produced, where you have separate components, like you have a separate display and stuff like that, not built in. And that was to accommodate something that the original Macintosh sort of eschewed, which was expandability. With the Macintosh 2, Apple introduced NUBUS, NUBUS, which was basically their alternative to ISA. Apple was very big, is still big on, hey, we like this standard, but we want to tweak it and do our own little thing. So the NUBUS standard cropped up right around these machines. These are also the first machines that used Apple's Apple Desktop Bus interface, or ADB. You'll hear that a lot. So everything from here moving forward, and the machines we're going to talk about with this talk are going to be ADB based. So those are a little bit easier to find than those original machines for like the original compact Macs. So they're out there. You can find them pretty easily. These machines are really great too because they'll also run System 6 very, very well. And then also earlier versions of System 7 for kind of that added features and functionality, and they just fly. They're really great machines for those. Um, There are one thing to kind of keep in mind with these machines with batteries is that a lot of these have two PRAM batteries inside. The original ones are soldered on the board. Some later revisions actually have it sort of in a like a little PCB, and they're mounted on top of it. There's, I think, our friend Adam, who does Adam's Apples, uh, did sort of a write up on those recently, where it just showed kind of the different ways that Apple addressed that with the Macintosh 2 series. But something to keep in mind is if those batteries are dead, the machine's dead. You're going to have to replace those batteries either with soldering replacements, or if you're lucky enough to have one of the later models that have the battery carrier built onto the board, um, then you can replace those and and test to see if it's working. There is a way that you can kind of jump start
Yeah,
those machines, and but there's more information online. I know there's a couple of videos on YouTube that'll kind of show you the procedure for doing that. Um,
yeah,
these machines have 6 expansion slots. So you really have like the sky's the limit in terms of what you can do with these machines compared to the other ones. But something you have to keep in mind is one of those slots is always going to be kind of dedicated to your video solution. And these are the machines where, again, with Apple producing color machines for the first time, there's like a whole world of different options. Uh, there are color cards that support like high resolution. There's some that are specifically made just kind of for 640 by 480, just for like general office purpose. They made a whole series of page displays, which are designed to be exactly sort of, you can view a sheet of paper of 8.5 by 11 piece of
yeah.
paper. So that
Portrait.
way, yeah, portrait. And then they had like the dual or two page displays. So you kind of see two side by side. This is really where the desktop publishing revolution kicked off, is with these early Mac 2s. Um, some of the earlier ones, like the two, shipped with 800K floppy drives, which these machines came around about the same time as the next series we're going to talk about. Um, so that was just kind of the standard at the time, to not have the high density floppy. But Apple later released an option where you can replace the floppy, or it's IWM. That's probably not correct, but
No, that's
maybe.
correct.
Oh, okay. Whew, I was going to say swim chip for a second. That's not it. But
Well, it's either way, it's the floppy controller chip. If we got it wrong, that's what it is. You replace that in the ROMs, and it
mhm.
could support these bigger disk options that it
Yeah.
originally couldn't do.
So then you can have the 1.44 megabyte floppy disks that have parity kind of with your PC friends, which made it a whole lot easier to exchange disks back and forth. PC world, those double density disks are 720K. So there were maybe some software solutions out there to kind of let you do it, but it was always like a kludge to get that to work. So um, it was kind of nice to have that parity with the PC world. Um, the top end for this line, or these machines, are 68020s. The original Mac 2 is the 2X is an 030, 68030, but they're both 16 megahertz. Not very fast, but at the time were speed demons compared to some of these older Macs. The 2FX is a 40 megahertz 68030, which at the time represented like a huge speed improvement compared to the even these others in the same series. And Apple had several like code names and stuff for it that kind of like were very evocative of just what a speed demon this machine was. The only
Sure.
the only problem is the 2FX does require special memory, special what they call PAL memory, which is 64 pins, and it also has some very special requirements for how the SCSI bus is terminated. So if you buy a 2FX, hopefully whoever you would buy that from would absolutely have it complete with like everything you would need to make sure that like any external devices have the proper, and they're black, these black SCSI terminators and all of that. So um, Steve, what do you think about the early Mac 2 series?
I think they're great machines. I want to touch on one thing that you mentioned about the processor speeds, because
Mhm.
generally speaking, when you're working on a Mac and you talk about the software that's compatible with it, back in the day, the software would say, like, oh, you need a Mac Plus or higher, or you need Mac 2 or higher. They
Mhm.
very rarely, until the later days, would say, oh, you need a Mac 68030 at 16 megahertz with 2 megs of RAM. They were more generalized because the Apple machines were more standardized, whereas the PCs, it was the Wild West. They can configure any way you want. So, the Mac 2 was a 68020 at 16 megahertz, where the Mac 2X was a 030. Both of them had FPUs, but of course, the 2FX, which I think was 40 megahertz,
Hmm.
68030, just blew them out of the water. So,
Yeah.
it obviously had special memory and all that stuff, but it was a speed demon. And again, these machines are highly, highly upgradable. There were processor upgrades for them. Some shipped without a hard drive, but they all have onboard SCSI. So
Hmm.
it's just one of those things where, either of these machines are great. Just watch out for those batteries. You can jumpstart them, like we said. Some of them can have the battery terminals that were soldered in replaced by a socket if you're careful. But then again, these are great early Macs. They're expandable, they're modular, and you have color for the first time. So
Yeah.
there you go.
Very, very iconic. Plus, these were also the first machines that made it easy to add networking and SCSI accelerators. Well, I'm sorry, like SCSI controllers that might have an accelerator, RAM, or caching. And then these are the machines that also Radius released their Rocket line of accelerators for,
That's right.
where it was basically it was a Macintosh on a card that you would put inside your Mac, and you could do multiprocessing by just sending a task over to one of the cards to execute, and then you would get the results on your host machine. So,
Yeah, expect to pay big bucks for that card
oh
these
yeah.
days.
So these machines are very nostalgic for Mac people because they were cost prohibitive at the time for most people, and had some of the coolest cost prohibitive add-ons and accessories. So that anyway.
So we're going to talk about the compact Macs, the second generation of these systems. So that starts out with the Macintosh SE, which came in a lot of flavors. These again have black and white screens, so they don't do color. But the SE came out and it was a pretty good success because it was sort of what the original Macintosh in many cases should have been. It has one expandable slot, which we'll touch on in a bit. And it gives you a few more options. It had a space for a built-in hard drive. So if you paid the extra bucks back in the day, you could have a Macintosh SE with either one floppy drive and a hard drive, or just maybe a floppy drive if you couldn't afford it, or even two floppy drives and a hard drive. So the SE, the original, had 800K floppy drive capabilities. The SEFDHD, which stands for floppy drive high density, which was later renamed SuperDrive. So if you see those two, don't get those confused. They mean the same thing. They're identical except for the text on the front of the case. Those could read your 1.4 meg floppies and the older 800K disks as well. Now, you just don't want to be confused with the SE30. That's a whole different animal, has a different logic board in there. So if you see like an SE1/40, that was usually a 1 meg unit with a 40 meg hard disk there. That was, sold in some circles, branded that way. But if it's an SE/whatever, don't pay any attention to that. If it's a SE30, that's a completely different machine. Those are the more sought after models that we'll talk about in a second. But
Mhm.
it can be confusing seeing that.
Yeah. A fun side note is this, like what you were talking about with the 1/40 and all of that for the SE models. This is where Apple was sort of getting their legs in terms of trying to figure out what nomenclature they were going to name their machines by. So that's why we end up with those weird SE1/40. So there is no SE1. It's just the RAM hard drive configuration. But if Apple had stuck to their guns with the nomenclature that they had already started with the Macintosh II series, the Macintosh SE30, because much like the Mac 2X had a 68030, the Macintosh SE30 should have been the Macintosh SEX. So you can see the trouble that the marketing people would have had trying to get that into education, perhaps back in those days. I just thought that was a funny side note.
These Macs will teach things to all your kids.
It's,
They're,
it's
they're great.
talk to your kids about Macintoshes.
Now, one thing that's great about the SE we touched on was expandability. So there is a single PDS slot in the Macintosh SE and the Macintosh SE FDHD, as well as the SE30. But it's very important to note that those PDS slots are different. The pinout is different, and the connector is different. So the SE and the SE30 do not have interchangeable PDS add-ons there. So you just want to be careful about that. If you're buying a card online, like a networking card or some type of external display adapter, they go for quite a bit of money these days. So you want to make sure you're getting the right one for your system. Otherwise, you're going to end up with something you probably can't use. Now, the SE and the SE30 have a power supply that is sort of a little bit of a departure from the original Compact Macs, which everything was built into the analog board. So there's a separate power supply that powers the machine and the display, and a separate analog board that also powers the display. So those things have to be recapped. You have to take a look at them. These machines are getting up there in age as well, from 87 to 91. So any of these machines, you're going to likely have to recap the analog board. What's nice to know about the SE and the SE FD-HD/SuperDrive models, their analog boards generally don't, I'm sorry, their logic boards generally don't have to be touched. They use axial capacitors, which generally speaking don't fail as the higher of a rate as the electrolytic capacitors rather that we see in models like the SE30. The SE30 always leaks and is always problematic in the way it does. The SE and the SE30 sometimes have soldered in batteries, not on the little terminal or the socket on the board, so be aware of that. So you want to try and, again, get into that case, remove the few screws from the top and the bottom. There are 4 of them in total, and take a look at that. The battery is under the board there. So you want to make sure that you can get a look at that when you're looking at this machine to buy potentially. Otherwise, you could get something that's battery bombed and not savable. The other thing to mention here about these machines is that sometimes the case has been swapped. So just be aware that if you see an SE30 and they don't have the ability to turn it on, sometimes a board was damaged or a system was upgraded. So you might see the case not matching the machine. That goes same for the earlier Compact Macs. You might think you're getting a 512K, but you get a plus, and that might sting. So just be aware of that. You might have to open up these machines to identify them.
Thank you for bringing up that that machine that I bought. I thought I was getting something and I got something else. They took lots of photos, but just not the one photo that I needed to make sure that what the machine was. So, but sometimes that just happens in this hobby, and it's okay.
And in a way to thank Ron for all this lovely information, feel free to donate a Macintosh 512K to him. And a TAM, why not?
Yeah, that would be amazing. I'll take a 20th anniversary Mac. That'd be great.
So the Mac Classic and the Classic II were sort of the low-end compact Macs. These were released later on in the line, and they were sort of, hey, here's a Mac that you could have at a cheap price. You don't have to go crazy here. In fact, they've released a lineup of the Classic that included no hard drive, and it was the cheapest Mac at the time at $9.99. And the Mac Classic is interesting. You can actually boot from the ROM by holding down Command-Option-XO on the keyboard as soon as you turn it on. And that'll boot into a very limited version of System 6, but it's one of the very few Macs that can actually boot up without any floppy drive or hard disk in there. You boot straight up to this OS, which is great because you could format a floppy, you could format a hard disk if you had the right software and such. So it really opens up the abilities there if you have that system. Now, it is limited a bit to 4 megabytes of memory. The SE and the SE30 could have much more, but the problem obviously is, with later versions of the system software like 7.5, 4 megabytes doesn't really cut it. The Classic 2 can hold a bit more memory, I think at 10 megabytes. Again, you could confirm all these specs on some of the sites we'll give you later on, but they're pretty okay for doing your day-to-day tasks. Again, they all have black and white screens, no color here, but a lot of the applications that you run on these Macs, are fine without any color. And some of the games were designed for these systems in the day. So you don't have to really, be too concerned about if it's the right resolution or things like that, or they have the right sound card or things. Those are more PC oriented problems where the Macs, the developers really, took the lowest end machine that they could develop for and, just tried to work on that. Mm-hmm. I will say that the Classic and Classic 2, along with the SE30, really have bad logic boards. And that just means that the capacitors on these machines have likely leaked already, caused a lot of damage. You're going to have to get a lot of those machines fixed. And unfortunately, in the case of the Classic, those have sound chips that are just placed right around where those capacitors leak. And the sound chip on Macs is actually, pretty important. it does carry a lot of signals that without it, the machine may not even boot up. So, the sound chip failing, you won't get any sound and you may damage some way that the machine can start up. So again, analog boards and logic boards on the classics are something to look out for. And it's just one of those things that unfortunately comes with the territory of these machines. People didn't really open them up. They didn't really service them. Things that get hot inside. And so you want to check out for the battery and the capacitors if you can, by bringing a Torx 15, I think it is, screwdriver, and just cracking these open if you get a chance to inspect one in person.
Next up on the list, we have the Macintosh LC series, which LC, everybody's like, oh, they're low cost. Well, the LC stands for low cost color. So good for Apple's marketing team. But these machines are basically, especially the LC and the LC2, are just sort of reworked versions of the Macintosh 2s. Cost reduced down to the point where you can get them in the door for education, who was kind of the original market for some of these. The machines have one LC style PDS slot, which is not compatible with backward compatible with like the SE30. It's not backward compatible with the uh, the original SE or any of that, and it does not work with new bus cards either. So it's kind of its own thing. But what is really nice is Apple stuck with this slot design for quite a while, and there is a ton of machines out there, even up to some PowerPC machines that will even support that LC PDS, some of those cards, assuming that they meet some very strict kind of guidelines. Um, some cards require 24-bit addressing and things like that only these older machines support. So you will have to definitely do your research before you just slap anything in. But they are they're really nice little machines. Some of them require you to have a working parameter battery for them to boot up properly and actually display an image, especially like what they call the LC475. That's kind of like a Quadra-esque machine. We'll talk about those here in just a minute. But those, you'll turn them on and you will not get video. You'll get a chime, but that's about it. You can kickstart them by turning them off and turning them back on, like on, off, on, and you can kind of kickstart it and they will boot, but I know that's kind of tough on your system, tough on your power supply. It's probably best to investigate some sort of battery replacement for those. All of these machines are going to require a recap. Uh, and it's even humorous because in some models like the original LC, there is a Apple specific recall where people would bring their machines in to replace one of the surface mount capacitors. Apple literally replaced it with it from memory, it looks as big as like a double A battery. That's a giant electrolytic cap that just kind of like lays over sideways on the motherboard. I've seen so many of those over the years, and first I was kind of like, oh my gosh, like some kind of like, who did this in their basement? No, it was Apple. Apple did it to replace a problem with some of those early boards. Um, but yeah, you're going to have them recapped. And what Steve and others kind of term the cap forest. It's back in like if you're standing in front of the machine, the back left of the motherboard, there are a ton of very nested capacitors there, all of which are going to require to be replaced because otherwise you're going to have weird wonky sound. You're going to have bad video. It'll distort the video on the machine because of the leakage of those caps. It's just something to look out for. Power supplies as well. There's a lot of these machines that will have leaky caps inside the power supply that'll affect like some of the ICs that are in there. There's octocouplers and things like that that are right next to some of those devices. They'll go bad, so you have to double check the power supply as well. There's several different manufacturers of power supplies across the history of the machine. They're each different, require different cap kits, require different strategies for repair. Not every model of LC came with a hard drive. The original LC comes with, or the LC series rather, but the original LC had an option for two was it even high density? I thought like there was even an 800K option for really trying to save money.
It
But
might have been.
yeah, I wouldn't doubt it. But the whole thing was that the original LC has a second knockout in the front where you can have dual floppies. So if you maybe had an external drive that you shared across a couple of machines in a computer lab or something like that, or if you just had all of your software on floppies already, it was an inexpensive option for people. The Like I was saying, the you have those original two LCs. The LC3 is basically a 25 megahertz 68030 that makes some design changes on the board that greatly improve the speed. The original LC and LC2 both are 32-bit processors on a 16-bit bus. In that you have to pair two 30-pin SIMs on those machines to actually supply memory to those.
Yeah.
The LC3 has a 72 pin, a 32-bit memory path. So it is just immediately faster because it's just not needlessly hobbled by that slower bus, which is kind of more in line with some of those with the early Mac 2 machines. They did a speed bump model for a while. It's called a LC. It's a 3 plus. That's a 33 megahertz LC3. You can actually perform that upgrade at home by just moving a resistor. There's plenty of guides online on how to do that. Uh, if you were to grab any of these, maybe an LC3 would be a really nice, speedy machine for you. Um, but don't discount that LC475 because it's kind of a compromised Quadra machine, but it is very fast. It does have a 68040 microprocessor, but no FPU. At least on the LC3, you can add an FPU if you had an application that specifically reported that or required that rather, or if you had something that would take advantage of it in some manner. Um, these machines, unlike some of the others, they'll actually work with just regular VGA monitors with a basic adapter. It's DB15 on the Macintosh side to HD15 on the PC side, and then you can hook that up. You can probably find them for under $20, maybe on eBay or Amazon.
Yeah.
The adapters that have the dip switches are probably your best option because that will let you. A lot of these Macintosh monitors, if you bought a real Apple monitor, there was sense technology in there that would basically report back and forth between the monitor and the Macintosh to say, okay, these are the resolutions I support. If you have a generic PC monitor, that that sense is not there. So the adapters that have dip switches, you can fake it. So you set the dip switches for exactly the resolution you want. That's what the Macintosh will interpret. And just when it powers on, I mean, it'll be like 800 by 600 or whatever resolution that you kind of want to go for. Something to keep in mind on these is depending on how they were stored, a lot of these are going to have a lot of the bromine or depending on who you listen to about the retro bright sort of community. They are going to be discolored. You could do some retro brighting on those. The plastics on them will be exceedingly brittle. So just make sure that again on the back there are two clips that you have to kind of lift up. You want to make sure the first time you open them that you use as gentle a pressure. Maybe move the case where you're not lifting straight up. Maybe you're trying to open it side to side. Don't be afraid to use a spudger or something just to kind of break that tension back there, just where you can not break your new acquisition. A lot of these machines are going to have potentially have sound problems just because the sound chip is right over there in that capacitor forest. And so you will have just weird, you may not have any sound at all. The machine may not boot at all because you can actually have shorts underneath that chip because the electrolytic fluid flowing underneath it. So you definitely need to be on the lookout for that. Steve also wanted me to mention that the power supplies, if you do just have a straight dead power supply, it is nice that if you have a good working one, you can test several units because it just sits right on the side. It is very easy to just pop out and move and take to different machines. And even nowadays, there are PC replacement PCBs where you can use like Pico PSU to just replace that old power supply with a completely modern replacement.
Yeah, these are great machines. They are on the lower cost side, so you'll usually find a lot of them in schools and different places that had a lab full of machines. And they also went by a different name. So you may have heard the word Performa before. The Macintosh Classic 2 was also sold as a Performa 200. It's just a different name. They're exactly the same machine. So in the LC series, there are quite a few different Performas. There is a 405, there's a 430, there's a 450, a 410, a 460.
Hmm.
And they came out during different periods of time at Apple. You're going to want to look up the corresponding LC model because one will be an LC or an LC2 or an LC3 with just a different name because they were bundled with a monitor or a dial-up modem or a package of software, a
Hmm.
different hard drive size, etc. So it's really the same guts of the machine, but it might have a different name to it. And another thing with these machines, they have that one PDS expansion slot. And so usually if you look on the back of the machine next to the row of ports, if there's a beige plate in there, 9 times out of 10, there's probably not going to be an upgrade in there unless it didn't use the port. But it's good to look online because sometimes you'll see there's an Ethernet card there or the hard to find Apple IIe card is in there.
Hmm.
And so, that's something to look out for if you're at a garage sale or a swap meet or something like that, and you see one of these machines, check the back. Even if you don't need the machine, there might be a cool card in there that you could use in another system.
Absolutely.
So now we get to the Color Compact Macs. These are the first color machines that Apple released in an all-in-one form factor that were small, just like the previous Compact Macs that had a black and white screen. These are highly collectible machines because they only made two of them, and they are very popular because they're kind of cute. They're small, you could fit them in most overhead storage bins, and they have a color screen. Now there is a lot that you see about these machines of people modding them, and that's because the logic board just slides out so easily from the machine. There are two clips in the back, you remove that, and then you have access to the logic board and you could slide that out. That's great for upgrades, but it's also great for seeing the condition of the machine. You can see if the battery has leaked, if the capacitors have leaked. A good telltale sign that the capacitors have leaked, you'll see some liquid or fluid around there. You might also see a lot of dust or hair because that stickiness will attract that dust and hair. And it's a pretty good sign to say, okay, the caps need to be replaced around this area. Now, unfortunately, the analog board also has to be replaced on this machine, recapped rather, because of the leaking fluid in these. The monitor was on for a long time. It gets hot in there. So any real CRT based Mac, you might have to worry about recapping it. And that's a bit of a pain. The analog board recapping is not for everyone, but there are people that can help you out with that. What's nice is because the board slides out, you can upgrade it. We're going to talk about those upgrades in a second, but there are also mods to be done to go along with that upgrade to give you a bit of a higher res than the CRT. But something I do want to call out about this machine is it's so desirable. People want it even if they can't find it locally, and they'd buy it online, let's say even from overseas, because there are quite a lot of these in Japan or other places that people see, oh, that's in great condition, and they have it shipped. And I don't care how careful you are, 9 times out of 10, these things are going to be destroyed during shipping. The case will crack, the neck of the CRT will crack. That means your display is a goner, or it'll just get really roughed up. And these are beautiful machines. Obviously, no one's going to have access to perfect ones. But if you really can avoid shipping it, I would. Even people who are tried and true, used to doing this for eBay or places like that, all you need is a bad route that the truck takes or the package delivery person takes, and the machine could
Hmm.
get damaged. So you just want to be careful with that. They're not so common these days like they were in the past. These machines are soft power machines. So again, if you do not have the keyboard, if you flick that power switch, it's going to seem like it's dead, but it's not. You need the keyboard plugged in. You need to push the power button. That light will come on the Mac if it's working, and you'll get a chime. If not, you probably need the analog board or the logic board recapped. You can fiddle around with that to try and get that working. Now, some of the mods, do you want to talk about that, Ron? Some of the upgrades that people do to these machines to get a
Oh,
little more power out of them?
I was going to leave all that to you, but you mentioned about the soft power.
Yeah.
There is also a physical on-off switch on the back. So there's a lot of people that will see that on-off switch and they'll think, "Oh, okay, well now it should be on. It's not on. What's wrong?" So it's you can have it's horse and cart with that. So make sure the physical power switch is on and then hit the hit soft
Yes.
power. They couldn't have made it more confusing for people, especially schools. But yeah,
Yeah. So most people just left that switch on all the time, so they don't even remember that there's a little switch in the back by
right.
the power cord. But
Mhm.
yeah. So another reason why these machines are so desirable is because Apple was originally going to release a Color Classic 3. Now the Color Classic 2 is very similar to Color Classic with a bit of a speed bump, and that's basically it. However, they were going to release a Color Classic 3 that was even faster, but they never did. And that originally just was released as one of Apple's LC or Performa models in the 500 series. So what you can actually do is take a logic board from one of these later Macs that we'll be talking about a bit. So like the LC575, which has a faster processor and a bit of other features that these Macs didn't have. And you could take the original classic board out, put one of these boards in, and with some software and or hardware modifications, depending on the route you want to go, there's tons of documentation about these mystic Macs out there. We'll put a link in the description there. You can get a bit of a better experience with these Macs. So you could get a 640 by 480 screen resolution if you do a mod to it, and you could run some software that you might not have been able to run on a stock Color Classic. So it really takes these machines to be a bit more usable. And some people just go all out. They'll put a whole Mac Mini inside of there, or put I think there was a 6200 board you could put in there, or a 6500 board. Put a G3 upgrade in there, and people love these machines because they're so tiny, so they go all out with them.
Absolutely. I love those machines. They're so great. Please don't ship them. Please
Yes,
don't ship
please
them.
don't.
I mean, I understand. Find a way to meet him halfway. Find a friend that lives there that'll be willing to go and pick it up and hold on to it until you can get there. Yeah, don't put them in the mail, please. So, kind of after that, we have kind of the later Macintosh II machines that kind of bridge the worlds between uh, where you had the Macintosh II with all this expandability and the huge case on your desk, and then everything got micronized with the LC series, and then they kind of brought these machines to be kind of the middle ground. With the creation of the 2CI and 2CX. Those machines are uh, they're great little machines. They're 68030, 16 megahertz. I think the 2CX is 16 and the CI is 25 something, or I got that flippy flopped, something like that. But um they were great machines. One was kind of a more cost abbreviated version. It has built-on video. The 2CX, which is kind of the beefier model, has no built-in video, so you do have to sacrifice one of your new bus slots to adding video to that. But then again, all the rest of these in the series have integrated video, and moving forward, pretty much everything we're going to see is going to have integrated video and just have video upgrades as an option later.
Yeah, and it is confusing the way they named these systems because the 2CX came out first, although it sounds
Mhm,
like a machine that came out later.
mhm,
So the 2CI is a bit faster than the 2CX, but the 2CI is a bit newer than that. So,
mhm.
that just to be aware, the 2CI also has this cache card that was an option, but after it was a popular machine a few years later, that was included. So if you get one of the cache card, that's a nice little upgrade in your machine.
Oh yeah. So if you are searching for one, I think that there are a couple. Like I think Drake or somebody somebody in our circle was talking about recreating some of those things, Silicon Insider or somebody. Um, but there were a lot of accelerators that use that slot in the 2CI and all that. So just something to be on the lookout when you get these machines to see what upgrades people have done to them back in the day. But do keep in mind that that the PRAM battery on these machines leak like a sieve, and it causes a lot of issues. So definitely Your eBay photos and stuff are probably not going to show those things. So, but don't be afraid to reach out to the seller and just say, hey, like, when was the last time the parameter battery was changed? If they say, what's that, or never, then you might keep moving, or you might come up with a low ball offer on the idea that it's just being sold as scrap. Um, the 2CX and 2CI both suffer from capacitor issues that affect the startup circuitry. So uh, that's going to stop them from turning on until you resolve that, or everything will be okay and it'll look fine. It'll boot up and then it will just power off, just in the middle, just as kind of your machine warms up, things get bridged. It shuts your machine down, and then you're very sad. The 2SI was sort of a machine that came a little bit later, maybe priced a little lower. It has a special PDS slot that is not compatible with anything else except for itself. But Apple did realize that people may want to have a little bit of expansion, so they released a adapter card that lets you use a FPU, and it gives you a 7-inch new bus slot. Now, up to this point, most new bus cards, I'm going to say almost all new bus cards, were 12 inches. So that required a lot of companies to update their designs and stuff if you wanted to sell the 2SI customers, um, which many didn't. So you don't see until much, much later um, very many cards that machine could use. And probably the primary one that most people used was either a video card or networking. Just because you might, this is a newer, faster color Mac that you might want to get on your network somewhere. The 2SI also has kind of a weird issue with video, where it has a built-in, it's got built-in video, and it has the 1 megabyte of built-on RAM on the motherboard. It's so slow. It's hobbled compared to RAM that you'd actually just put in the slots. So a story I kind of told at VCF Midwest was that I had a friend who had a Macintosh 2SI. I think it had like 5 megabytes of RAM. And I was poking around his machine one day, and in the cache settings, he had it set to use the like 1 megabyte of RAM as disk cache. And in those days, RAM was very much premium. I was like, oh my gosh, why do you have it configured this way? And he showed me the difference, just how slow that onboard RAM was compared to using the RAM that's actually in the two 30-pin SIM sockets. Uh, so the I was like, wow, that's amazing. If you move all that, like you block off that first bit of RAM, it just greatly improves the speed of the machine. Um, just really strange. Then Apple kind of made a shift, and they, especially right about the time that multimedia started taking off, they wanted more and more machines that could accommodate CD-ROM drives, had more expansion maybe in that space. So Apple released the 2VI and the 2VX. The 2VI is a certified road Apple. That is, it's another one of these machines. It's got like 16-bit bus, 32-bit processor, so you have a lot of limitations just right out of the gate. Thankfully for people in the US, we didn't get this model. This was sold exclusively overseas, so the chances you're going to run into one is really, really low. There are some people online that kind of wax poetic about it just because it was the Mac they had, but I secretly, deep down, they all wanted a 2VX. The 2VX shares a similar case design. Again, these were the first ones that could kind of accommodate a CD-ROM drive. Some of them just had nothing there at all. It was just covered up. And then you could order a kit from Apple to add a CD-ROM. There was a replacement bezel that would either give you a caddy loading mechanism, or much later a tray loading mechanism.
These Macs are soft power machines as well, so there is a power button on the back of the machine that will turn the system on, but you could also turn them on via the keyboard. Most of these machines have a power button that you can actually turn with your fingernail or a coin. And the reason behind that was sort of to let these machines boot up right away after a power failure. So it sort of left that power button pushed in, and because it was soft power, it would let you, have those machines just come back up as soon as power was given back to it. But you can boot them up without a keyboard. However, like we were saying before, a lot of the 2CX, 2CI models have startup circuitry issues. So, because of those leaky caps, you just have to be aware of that.
These are my favorites, man. So that's good on you.
Yeah, no, these Quadras are great, and you can help me out with this a little bit. But you know, Ron knows why the Quadra is so popular, and he's going to tell us now because it was his favorite movie.
Oh, hopefully no copyright strike. Thankfully I dipped out on the stuff, but everybody loves that Quadra 700 because of Jurassic Park, for the same reason they love some of those Sun machines, and that's why
Yep.
everybody in their basement now has a one of those thinking machine cray whatever, like whatever that the thinking machine. Everybody's got one in their basement now. It was the thing in the 90s. It was hypercolor t-shirts and Quadra 700s.
So the Quadra brand name was sort of their like high end business, type power user name, and Apple used it for quite a long time. So these are the first machines that use that name. So the Quadra 700 is in a very similar case to the 2CI and the 2CX, but they added different little buttons on the front, so they're little circular interrupt and reset buttons on the machine, and it has these feet that you could actually have it so it stands right up.
Mhm.
Now, something that we've touched on a little bit, but I just want to make sure is clear. You don't need an Apple monitor per se to use with these modular desktop Macs. You can use a standard PC monitor or an LCD display with a VGA port as long as you have that DB15 to VGA adapter. Some have dip switches, some don't. The ones with the switches give you a bit more compatibility. I would recommend those, especially if you're going to be dealing with multiple Macs. But just one of those things to keep in mind if you're brand new to these machines, you may not be aware of that. Now, the Quadra 700 only has two new bus slots, but its onboard video has its own dedicated video memory bank. So you can, add a lot of memory to that, which is nice.
Mhm.
The 900 and the 950, I'm not too familiar with, but I just picked up a Quadra 950 at VCF Midwest this year.
Threw your
Um,
back out too, right?
Threw my back out too.
They're big. They're
Uh,
big.
they are big. They're taller than a Mac Pro or a G5 tower to give you, an understanding of the size if you ever saw one of those. But what's nice about all three of these, and I know for the fact of the 700 and the 950, and I'm going to assume the 900, is they all have tantalum capacitors. And those are a type of capacitor that is a solid state SMD component. They don't generally fail like an electrolytic capacitor, which would have a little pool of corrosive liquid that would destroy the traces on the board. So generally speaking, these logic boards are usually okay. Now, tantalum capacitors can fail, but it's more rare that they do in the explosive sense that electrolytic ones do. They can explode, but that's a story for another day. Um, the power supplies in these is probably something you have to take a look at just to be sure that they're okay. Same goes to the Mac 2 models we were just talking about. But the Quadra 700 power supply is the same as the 2CX and the 2CI. There are reefer caps in there. There are things that probably need to be serviced. The 900 and 950 have a huge power supply. That is the entire depth of the machine. So that is something that you'd like to take a look at. There's a huge intake fan to keep that cool. You might want to consider cleaning that, which goes
Mhm.
for any of these machines. Dust it out, make sure that things can breathe in there. Now, what's something that you also have to be aware of, just like the 2CI 2CX, the battery is under the hard drive carrier on the Quadra 700. It's a bit more visible in the 900 and 950. So if you're looking to see if there's any damage, you want to be careful about that. These machines also have a special PDS slot that is actually first introduced, I believe, on the 2VI or the 2VX, that can actually accommodate a PowerPC upgrade. That was the next processor architecture that Apple was shifting to in the mid 90s. So they were sort of forward thinking there, having this slot to be available. Now, is it going to be as fast as your dedicated Power Macs? No. However, it will give you that ability to run software that may only run on PowerPC systems. Some of those cards are a little bit harder to find these days, but sometimes you could get an Apple one or a Daystar one relatively cheap if you look at the right place.
Mhm.
The 900 and the 950 are a bit higher end models. Expect to pay a little higher price for those. They are also very large, brittle plastics on the door and the holders that hold in the NuBus cards. So, I wouldn't really ship those unless you have somebody that really knows what they're doing. They are boxy. There's no, display in it to worry about, but they are highly sought after machines just because of their iconic look. The 900 and the 950 had a case that was never used on any other Macintosh. It was used on a server later on, but not a Macintosh. So something to be aware of because they are quite unique in that regard.
Absolutely. I love these machines. They're so collectible. They're so iconic. So if you can
And
find
they're
one.
fast. They're fast too. I
Mhm.
think the 950. If I stall for time as I look at Mac Tracker here,
Yeah.
I believe it has a processor that is it a 40
I thought
megahertz?
it was 33 megahertz 68.
33. That's
Yeah.
what it is. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. I'm thinking of the ones we'll talk about in a bit. But the
Hmm.
33 megahertz is no slouch in the 68K world. It's
Especially with
the second.
FPU and yeah.
Yeah, it's the second fastest processor I think Apple sold at the time.
Steve, are you going to tell them why it's called Quadra?
No, because I forgot at the spur of the
It's
moment. How about you tell them?
Oh, it's because it uses the Motorola 68040 040, so four quad Quadra.
I thought they
That's
just put these things on quads and drove them around at the
yeah,
campuses.
probably yeah, it's fine. You running around the quad at campus and right, I get it. No, it was just a bit of marketing to let people know, um, sort of like, because in those days, everybody was very much kind of excited about it was like, oh, I've got my case badge that has 386 and 486 on it. And the Quadra machines, it was just a shorthand to let people know that it used that faster 68040 chip. And then you could talk to your Apple dealer about more specifics on that. But with every triumph, there is often a failure. And that failure is Centris, Centras, sorry, Centris. Yes, one of them's got to be right. But the Centris series was kind of a weird thing. It was just a marketing thing that Apple tried. It was just a very short-lived series of machines, and they kind of represent a misstep and then a correction because the Centris machines are typically kind of clocked slower than Quadras, so that there was not any direct competition in that same section of what Apple was trying to sell. They don't include FPUs, and for the most part, they're kind of clocked slower than Quadra machine or the Quadra machines that kind of replace them. The Centris 610 kind of has a very interesting footnote about it. It's a 20 megahertz 68040 with no FPU, but Apple did release the Quadra PDS uh, PowerPC upgrade card and recommended that for Centris users to kind of join that next generation of machines without having to replace things. It represents the very slowest PowerPC that Apple ever quote produced. Because those cards clock doubled the base machine. It is a 40 megahertz 601 chip PowerPC. Very sad, very sad. It was even some of the tech demos and stuff that Apple released, kind of contemporary to that, with max RAM, max VRAM on those machines, were so pitiful that they stopped talking about it. Since Centris 660 AV was just like a flash of light just going past. So if you can find one of those machines, they're highly collectible. You won't find one. You won't find one. They're in an e-cycle or e-waste somewhere 30 years ago. But the Centris 650, probably not a terrible machine. It's the same thing as a later Quadra model, just without the FPU. But nice expansion, all of that, and Steve will tell you all about those here in a minute. The 650 does have tantalum capacitors, which is nice. The Centris 610, I think, uses a combination of both, depending on what part of the board you're on. Um, but it's still not great.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Centris 650 actually does have an FPU, but it's 25 megahertz, whereas the Quadra variant was 33.
Oh, that's
So it
right.
was It was the higher end one, but you have to be aware, like when you get to the Centris 650 or 610, and then you get to the Quadra 610, 650, there were a few configurations at the time, and sometimes Apple would just sell you what was available with the new badge name in a sense of a Quadra. So some of them did have the LC or for 040 processor, the 68 LC or 040, which did not have an FPU. That's what the LC stands for. So no math coprocessor in that one. But the full 040 or the 68040 processor did have an FPU or a math coprocessor. And depending on the model you bought, let's say it was the 610 Quadra without the CD-ROM drive, you may not get that coprocessor in there. So it's something you just have to be aware of when you're looking at the specs of these machines and you're looking them up, and maybe it's in person. You could flip the lid and take a look. You might have a heat sink over there, but if you look at the processor, it will tell you right on the top of it if it's an LC or not.
Yeah. A bit of advice: if you do buy one of these machines and you do have them shipped, they will ship okay. A 650 probably better than the others. Do not ask the seller to remove the heatsink off of the CPU so that you can verify what's in there, because I repeatedly see stories online where sellers just grab the flattest flat blade they have and just start jiggling and a jaggling and gouge the motherboard or break the socket, or will actually like crack the ceramic on the chip. And then you were kind of like, you open it up, everything looks good in the photos, you get it, it doesn't power on, and it's because you have in your hubris, you you have encouraged them to damage this machine. So don't do it.
Yeah, what is nice about the Centris 650 and the Quadra 650, and we could go to the next slide, I
Oh,
guess,
sure.
is that they actually can accept a PowerPC upgrade. They
Mhm.
do have the same PDS slot like a Quadra 700, and really the Centris 650 and the Quadra 650 are not bad machines at all. You could have an optical drive like a CD drive in there, which you can't do on the Quadra 700. You get one more new bus card slot that the Quadra 700 didn't have, and you have the ability for that PowerPC upgrade. So you do have some options there. It's a machine that I think if you see and you're new to this stuff and you don't have one, you should certainly pick it up. What's nice about the Centris 650 and the Quadra 650 is that they both have an AAUI connector on it, which is Apple's Ethernet transceiver compatible port. So you can plug in one of these little boxes, whether it was from Apple or Asante or Farallon or one of these companies, and convert that AAUI connector on the back to something like 10 base T Ethernet or BNC ThinNet, stuff like that. So
Mhm.
that's a cool feature because you can network these machines pretty much out of the box. They did this because at the time that Ethernet standard wasn't settled. So rather than Apple, attaching their horse to one of these Ethernet carts, they could say, well, we'll just provide this networking chipset on the board, and then you just plug in whatever low cost transceiver that was probably about 30 or 40 or $50 that you could
Mhm.
add on to connect to the network of your choice. And that's what they did. You'll find a lot of these Macs in this era and later on into the early Power Macs do have that AAUI connector. Some of them have it with an Ethernet port on board, your standard T-base Ethernet on board, but it's a nice touch. It allows you to communicate and transfer files over these Macs pretty easily as long as you have that little adapter.
Since we've kind of delved into this, do you want to start at the top of the list and just kind of go down, and then
Sure.
we'll get down. Things go really great for a while and then they go bad all of a sudden. So
Yeah, yeah. So the 605 Quadra here is very similar to the Performa 475. The case design is a little bit different. You have sort of those baby elephant feet, the little curved design language. Was it a faster processor? I forget off the top of my head.
it's a 25 megahertz 68030, or I'm sorry, 25 megahertz 68040, but it's the non FPU version, so the
Yeah,
LC 68040.
yeah. And so then you have the Quadra 610, which is in the picture here. So that is similar to the Centris 610. Optional CD-ROM drive. The floppy drive may look a little bit different. That's the whole manual inject floppy drive versus the auto inject floppy drive. All you have to know about that is each require a little bit more fiddling if you have to repair them. But that's a topic for another day. The 650 we already covered. The 660 AV is the same as the Centris, just with some minor speed boosts in there and a different name.
What does
And
AV
what we
stand for? What
audio
does the AV do?
visual.
Ooh.
So that gave you, and this was huge back in the day, which we're going to talk about a little bit more with the 840 AV. It gave you composite and S video input and outputs. That's analog video, standard definition, in and out. And they used these special signal processors that gave them this extra boost because these were still 68K max. They weren't the fastest things out there, but these special processors that they put on the board allowed them to actually work with this multimedia that most PCs of the day couldn't handle. So they were the higher end machines out there, the 660 AV and the 840 AV, but they could handle right out of the box stereo audio and
Mhm.
standard definition video input and output, which was great because you could do presentations, you could import footage from your camcorder or your VCR, your Laserdisc player, and then you could export that back to tape where a lot of people did not have systems to convert a computer signal to a TV. There was no HDMI or DisplayPort or anything like that. It was a very different world of trying to get media onto something like a television or a projector. So VHS was usually what was used as something that you could, okay, I know I could put this on a tape and someone will be able to play it. Now, the Quadra 800 is a mini tower. It looks similar to the 8100 Power Max that would come later on. It's has more expandability. It's a 33 megahertz 040, so it has a FPU in there. Very quick machine. I believe it has two VRAM slots, and you could max that thing out to, I think, 136 or 37 megabytes of memory, which was stupid expensive back in the day. But you can do it today. I have mine with that amount of memory, and it has three new bus slots for expandability. A really desirable machine because they really only made a 268K max in that form factor. That's the 800 and the 840 AV. The 840 AV is one of those machines that is very desirable just because it's sort of an oddball. It was in this mini tower. It has a lot of the in and outs of the 660 AV, but it's a 40 megahertz 68040 processor, the fastest 040 Apple ever put in any of their 68K Max. It is an absolute monster, and because of that, these machines command a high price. Now, unfortunately, the 800 and the 840 AV, you will have problems with the bezels, and that's the little plastic pieces on the front where you'll have an opening for a floppy disk drive or a CD-ROM or a tape drive or something like that. And the problem with that is they do crack. They have issues. They will fall off. And it's just one of those things where if the cosmetics are important to you, it's going to be very hard to track those down or,
Mhm.
find one that's in good shape. So the 840 AV is a desirable model. I have one. It kind of works. Ron has one. It kind of works. So yeah,
You
it's on
you
my
have
bench.
two.
Well, and by my
Right.
powers combined, I have
Right.
two non-working
Right.
quadras.
Uh, the Tell us about the Quadra 630, Steve.
Sure. So the Quadra
Show us on the
630,
doll where the Quadra 630 touched you.
the Quadra 630 is an interesting thing, and we didn't really talk about the Performa 630, but the LC or the Performa 630 was a machine that kind of sort of wanted to be a low cost machine that a home or a school would buy because it had a CD-ROM drive built in, but it was one of those things where it was kind of slow and kind of sluggish, and you could tell Apple was, holding their pennies to not give you the best machine they could.
Mhm.
The Quadra 630, on the other hand, is a little bit better than the Performa. It can have a full 040 processor in there. I believe it is socketed, so you could
Mhm.
replace that if needed. The 630 series of Performers had all sorts of different names: 636, 636 CD. You could look up all the specs of them. They're very similar. Different software bundles because of the Performa name. That's the name of the game. They were trying to, carve out, this store aisle in Sears that only sold this bundle with the modem and all this stuff, etc. So the Quadra 630 is a little bit better than that, but I would not go out and purchase that as like, hey, I have a Quadra. It's not the best one to spend your money on.
Plus, IDE hard drives really, at the time, were very slow compared to SCSI drives, and this machine took advantage of that as a cost-saving measure. Uh, Not great. Something that is nice about it though is it does have some dedicated slots for like uh, like I think they have like a video in and out slot. That there's a card that you could purchase at the time
Yeah.
for doing video capture. There's also a com slot for either Ethernet or a modem, and then you still had a LC compatible PDS uh, slot in there, which could take a number of different upgrades and things that were available, video out solutions, all those type of things. Does not work with the Apple IIe option card that worked with the older LCs because the Quadra 630, by being a Quadra, is stuck in 24-bit mode, or at least this model is stuck in 24-bit, or stuck in 32-bit mode rather. Does not support 24-bit, which the other ones do.
Yeah, I mean, these shipped as a full 040 33 megahertz, but I wouldn't be surprised if someone took out the board because it's so easy to slide out the logic board of these models and just put a new one in that you might find one that is mismatched. So that's again something just to be aware of. It will need to be recapped, just like all of these machines in the list, with the exception of the 800, because that's all tantalum capacitors, and the 650, which is again tantalum capacitors. So you don't really have to worry about that. Generally speaking, I haven't had issues with the power supplies in most of these models, the exception of the 605 and the 610. I have seen some of those go bad, but it's just a matter of time. A lot of these things will need some attention. And the only thing I want to mention is because you do have the amount of slots that you do in the model, like the 630, either the Performer or the Quadra, you sometimes can find those machines pretty cheap, and maybe it doesn't work, but maybe it has an Ethernet card, or maybe it has a TV tuner card or something that you want to use.
Mhm.
So you just think about that. Even if the machine is dead, there may be some good parts in it.
Very true.
And you did touch on IDE drives. The one thing I do want to mention is don't think that you could probably use an IDE to compact flash or an IDE to SD card adapter with these machines. There's so many of those adapters out there. I've tried a few. None of them seem to work. It's very picky about IDE. Thankfully, you can boot from an external SCSI device. And in some testing that I've done, the external SCSI device, let's say by using a Blue SCSI DB15 model, DB25 rather, that's the external SCSI connector, you could boot off of that, and it's actually a bit faster than using the original Apple IDE drive, which is not too surprising.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Everybody loves these LC AO or AIO all-in-one machines, which kind of compromise a very mixed bag of machines. Um, you often saw these either under the LC or the Performa name. LC is for schools, homes, and you would see more Performas kind of in those retail spaces, Sears and things like that. And you'd see like a bunch of variations on these model numbers just because, like Steve was saying, it's like, oh, it's a software bundle, or it had this much RAM and this much hard drive, or or whatever, just to try to differentiate themselves from one another and to avoid having to price match. Because I used to, very very long time ago, I was going to look for, oh no, I have it right here. I actually used to work for Montgomery Ward, and back in those days we sold a lot of those Performa machines that where it would be like, oh, we sold the LC 57 or 475, or oh gosh, LC 575, and Sears might have the LC 576. So people come in and would be like, hey, well, Sears has got it for this, and it's like, sorry, we don't, it's the wrong model. And it was just a way for retailers to kind of get out from under doing some of those things. But the software bundle with the system, it really just kind of came down to wherever you bought it from. Much like the those earlier like Color Classics and like the Quadra 630 and stuff like that, we're now at a point where you can actually just remove a plastic housing and then slide the board out the back of the machine for easy repairs and upgrades. Um, you always absolutely want to make sure that if you're opening it up, you do check the battery. I think some of these use that very weird Rayovac square 4.5 volt battery. So
Yes.
so that does make that difficult. Most of these will they'll power on without it, right?
But generally speaking, you should not need it.
Okay. The something else to keep in mind is the 550, the 575 are very much um, or I guess you can include that Mac TV in that as well. Those boards are interchangeable, so it's very important to take a look at those and see what you have. Now, if you have a Macintosh TV board, you're going to know right away because it's got some different connectors on the back. But the 550 and the 575 are interchangeable, so it is something to be on the lookout for. That if somebody sells you a 575, which is probably the more desirable machine, that you actually do look at the board to verify that it has a 68040 microprocessor on it and not a 68030. You won't have that problem with the LC520 and the LC580 because those models are very different than everything else, because much like the Quadra 630, those were based around kind of cheaper standards. If you think about like an LC 520 or an LC 580, those are basically kind of a Quadra 630 in an all-in-one case. Whereas the 550 and 575 use a really brilliant looking Sony CRT, which is flat. The 520 and 580 use a cheaper, and I think it's Sanyo display that has a curve. So it's big, so and it's right there in your face. So it's kind of got a fishbowl effect on some of those things, which not everybody liked. Although I will say that back in the day, I had somebody return a 575 because they thought that there was a problem with the display because there are two control wires on those Trinitron monitors, and they were like, I can't not see them. Once my kid pointed them out, I can't not see them. They returned the machine and they actually bought the cheaper model, which unfortunate for them, but it addressed their needs, so it's fine. But the 520 or 520 and 580 IDE drives, all the that kind of comes with that. But you also want to kind of look at if you're looking at these machines and you're like, oh man, that Mac TV, that black case, black keyboard, that is the new hotness. It is the expensive crapness is what it is. That Macintosh TV has an 8 megabyte RAM limit. You can only capture still images. You can't record video because it's just a frame buffer. There's no actual DSP or anything. There's no additional hardware that actually lets you do anything. You can watch live TV, but you're just making screenshots, which honestly you could do with software at that point, which isn't great. Plus, you also have the specialty black ADB keyboard, the black ADB interconnect cable for the keyboard, and then the black mouse. And all of those are hard to find. They will set you back a pretty hefty sum. So I would not recommend it. These machines also have those little capacitor forests, like we were talking earlier. So lots of sound problems, things like that. They're going to require recap. They're probably going to definitely are going to require some sort of like sonic cleaning, or ultrasonic cleaning rather. I mean, just to get them kind of up and running. Plus, you've got brittle plastics, big, heavy CRT in there. They won't survive shipping. Don't ship them. Find somebody local, have them pick it up, go visit your buddy or whatever, and then get your machine.
Yeah, all you have to do is search for LC575 or Macintosh TV on one of these Facebook groups, and you'll see these horrendous crime scenes of these machines just destroyed beyond recognition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the plastics either are really pretty solid or they're pretty terrible. I actually bought two LC580s maybe in like the last 6 months, and I've got one that's in pretty good shape. It's a little yellowed. I've got another one that I actually just recently gave away as part of cleaning out some stuff after VCF Midwest. That I looked at it funny, and and the front bezel separated from the back of the case. I'm like, what are you gonna do? But these are also soft power models, so you do need to have a working keyboard to go ahead and power them on. They're gonna look dead unless you have a keyboard to actually power it up. So if you're gonna go somewhere and test something, bring a known good keyboard with you if you have one to kind of keep an eye on that.
Yeah. And if you don't get sound on these machines, it's probably like Ron mentioned, because of those capacitors leaking. In some cases, that will actually cause the machine not to turn on because there is another capacitor by the egret or CUDA chip. The same thing on the Color Classic I forgot to mention. It's because the boards are such of a similar design. That chip is really instrumental in making the machine turn on and boot. And if there's any leakage or corrosion or the pins aren't seated right on those, you could have issues with the machine not turning on. So that's something to consider with these models. Uh, just a note here, you cannot physically insert a 520 or a 580 logic board into a 550 or a 575. The edge connector that connects internal to the machine is kind of flipped. So you don't have to worry about screwing that up. Just don't really shove it in there because I'm sure if you tried, you could, especially with the brittle plastic.
Oh yeah.
I've heard these machines also have analog board issues. Thankfully, mine still works, but taking one of these apart, I know my friend Bruce of Brinkus Creations tried to do that, and his basically crumbled while he was doing it. So you got to be careful. And there were a few different naming conventions with these. There was like an LC588CD, again, into that Performa naming structure where they had different software bundled, etc. So if you don't see exactly the numbers you see here on this slide, it just means it's a variant. All right, so here we come with the first generation of Power Macintosh computers. Exactly. So these machines are quite interesting. One thing to note is although they run the same system software and they're like 99.9% compatible with all the previous software that ran on the previous 68K Macs, there are some pieces of software that will not run. And you just have to be aware of that. If you really want to have 100% compatibility with 68K Macs, you may want to have one in your collection. And collecting Macs is fun when you have multiples because you can network them. Some run software better than others, etc.
Triples is best, Stu.
Triples is best. Thank you, Ron. So these are still NuBus based. If you have any NuBus cards like a Radius Video Vision or anything that you paid a lot of money for back in the day and you still wanted to retain that functionality, maybe a Power Mac with a NuBus card would have been best. Now, the 6100 uses the same 610 case, and if you look at the physics there is no way you're going to fit a NuBus card in there. Now, they did make adapters for you to fit a NuBus card in the 6100. There were also other popular adapters like a G3 upgrade card later on and some DOS and Windows compatible cards you could install in the 610 or the 6100. Those require special adapters and such for those particular models, so you'll have to look into that. But basically, the 6100 is the least expandable. You only have that one PDS slot that can be adapted. Now, the 7100 and the 8100 both have multiple NuBus slots plus a different PDS connector. So you could, plug in a separate PDS connector rather. So you could plug in, let's say, a video card that runs a bit faster than a NuBus card would be able to, or offers you a few different options. There were a few cards that Apple provided that could be bundled in with these systems. But it's one of those things where it really depends on the type of system you want to collect. These early Power Macs, they may not be the best, but they are a good example of Apple's first generation into these systems. They could be a little slow. There were speed bumped models later on, so something to consider. The 7100 reused the same case as the 2VX, and the 8100 looks very similar to the Quadra 800 and the 840AV. Now, these do run System 7.1.2. That was the first version of the system software that ran on these Macs. They could run all the way up to Mac OS 9. It'll be slow, but if you have enough memory, they actually can do it. So again, these are okay systems. Don't overpay for them, especially because the onboard video connector here is a little bit weird. It uses something called HDI 45, High Density Interconnect 45. And Ron has a very rare and hard to find adapter. Well, they're not too hard to find, but when
Well,
you need
mine
one,
is signed by Computer Ken.
yes, yours is signed by Ken of the Computer Clan on YouTube. So that's a very hard to find one there. But those adapters are required to get the standard DB15 video output, which you could then convert to VGA or plug into your Mac monitor just without any further adapters. But it's a proprietary Apple port. There were a few third-party manufacturers that made adapters, but Apple's cable, like you saw Ron hold up there, is required to get video out of this machine if you do not have another PDS or NuVus video card. So if your machine that you're buying, either it's a 6100, 7100, an 8100, and it does not have that adapter, well, you're sort of out of luck. You won't get video on that. Either you have to pony up the money for the adapter, or make sure you get it super cheap so you could
Mhm.
build in the cost of that adapter to use the machine.
And that HD45 adapter connection on the back side there, the whole idea was Apple sold some monitors at the time that had like basically speakers and keyboard and mouse pass through,
Yeah,
and
microphone.
yeah, microphone. You needed a pin for everything you wanted to do, so you needed this big high density connection on the back of the scene to, or the back of the machine to make that happen. And they very quickly abandoned that.
Yeah, it was one of these things where it was, hey, it's the new connector that everyone's going to use. It's the future of the multimedia Macintosh, and it was the Audio Vision 14-inch and the Audio Vision 16. I'm sorry, 17-inch model. Those are the only two monitors Apple ever shipped with that connector. And yeah, as Juan was saying, it was very quickly phased out in favor of better options there because people didn't want to have another adapter just to run their Macintosh. It was something that they probably weren't too keen on when they saw this extra thing in the box when they were opening it for the first time.
You know, the best thing they did about those monitors is they shipped an adapter that basically took it in reverse and took that high density connection and actually gave you like a real Mac video connection and speakers and mouse, or you know, ADB and all that type of stuff, so you could use those somewhere else after you long ago gave up on whatever Apple was trying to lay down with that.
Yeah, so if you see one of those octopus connectors, you can't unfortunately plug it into these Power Macs. It's for the monitor, not the Macintosh itself. But again, if you find one of these cheap and it has that video adapter on there, these are not the bad machines that some people remember them as. Sure, they were expensive back in the day, but if you pick one up for, I don't know, $20, that's not bad. You
Yeah,
could steal some parts out of there if you need to. A floppy drive, a CD drive, maybe it has some nice expansion cards.
absolutely. So we now bridge over to the new era of Power Macintosh, which is the PCI Power Macintosh era. And what these were are basically this was a redesign of the Power PC platform, which those early Power PCs, much like some of the other designs that Apple had made, were kind of like shoehorning in Power PC technology onto like a Quadra 610 motherboard, or shoehorning it into like a Quadra 800 sort of board. Uh, these machines, these PCI machines, are a complete redesign that basically like updated the SCSI bus, made things a lot faster, DMA, and things that weren't present maybe in some of those older machines. It also uses 5-volt DIMM memory. So we're getting away from the 32-pin SIMs and stuff that the older machines used. And it was just a much slicker kind of board design. The cache slots and stuff like that, the VRAM, all of that had been updated to kind of take advantage of this new architecture. But the machines are really, really nice. Um, they also, except for the low end, which was the 7200, they actually have socketed, or it's a slot processor. So you could get processor upgrades and stuff for really the first time as like a first party Apple product. Or at least it made the way for accelerator companies like NewerTech and such to go ahead and make those accelerator boards to kind of squeeze a little more life out of your investment. But these machines will run everything from System 7.5 all the way up through macOS 9 with the right processor upgrades and the right RAM. Pretty competent OS 9 machine. These they did have was it both AAUI, so the Apple proprietary internet
Yes.
connection or Ethernet connection, and a real 10 base T port, both. So if you did need to go back, you had ThinNet or something at your operation, you could go and do that. um, Again, like I was saying with the processor upgrades, there's all kinds of G3 upgrade cards that you can put in these machines, so you can actually get up to OS X. Uh, but again, those probably require like a lot more RAM than maybe people were going to make the investment for back in the day, because 5-volt DIMMs are kind of pricey on on the secondary market these days. They were even more expensive back then. I remember I had a Quadra 610, I upgraded to a 7200, and I had to down the amount of RAM I actually had just because couldn't afford to buy those 5-volt
Oh
DIMMs.
yeah.
But it does open up a whole world of PCI expansion for you. So they ditched all the proprietary connections. You could, as long as the manufacturer was producing like a Mac ROM for whatever this device was, so it'd be like a video card or something like that, you could just drop those cards in and go. Um, the faster chipsets, again, the low end models were 601 based, the higher end models were 604 based. And then even later yet, there were the 604E, like speed bump kind of processor models. But these were really some of the fastest and most dependable Macs that Apple ever made before the G3 era. They are excellent bridge machines. So if you need to have backward compatibility with System 7, but you also need something that can also do System 9, you've got a whole world of software there. Or if you need to prep something or get something ready for an older Mac, they were designed to be very expandable, and you flip a couple switches. A couple little latches. Card cage opens up. Power supply and drives lift up out of the way, exposing the motherboard, SCSI connections, everything like that. So really easy. You can get in there and do some things. Some of the models have analog AV capture capabilities. Um, Definitely not the low end machines, but since multimedia and stuff was still kind of like the big hype at that time, Apple built a lot of those functions in just to try to woo consumers. Steve, what do you think about this series?
I think they're great. The 7200, like Ron said, built-in CPU, can't upgrade it, but any other of these machines, the processor's right on a slot. Think of like a Pentium 2, if you're familiar with that. You could just lift the whole thing out and install a new one in there. There are some specific cards for like the 9600 that have different voltages, or the power supply has enough oomph to get that processor going. So you just got to be careful when you're upgrading these machines that it is compatible. The 7500 is a 601, but it's a bit faster, and some of these had speed bumps later on. The 8600 and the 9600 are actually 604E or EV models, which are a bit of a faster 604 chip than, let's say, the 8500 or the 9500. But any one of these Power Macs, let's say for the 7200, is a safe goodbye. I mean, even if the plastics are a bit rough, they are excellent Power Macs to have in your collection. Again, the concept of bridge machines is, you're able to get online, you're able to read, let's say, a CD or a zip disk or a floppy disk, and you're able to, download stuff to this machine or transfer files to this machine. You have the built-in networking, which is great. And then you could make a boot disk, let's say, for an 800K Mac or something like that. Or you could transfer file or rename that file or compress or decompress that. So these machines are great. They could run System 7.5 through Mac OS 9. And if you have gobs of memory and maybe a better graphics card, you could put OS 10 on there. But yeah, really excellent machines. I would suggest to anybody, if you're getting into Macs, a Power Mac like this is pretty much essential for serving the 68K Macs or the earlier Macs in your collection.
Yep,
Because
absolutely.
they have all that legacy IO, those ports, serial ADB SCSI that you may need. Oh boy. So we were just talking about how the 604 processor and the 604E and EV processors were great. Well, there's a period of time here where we weren't all roses and kittens. The 603 processor was kind of a middle of the road processor. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't good either. So you have a few machines here that use that. And whether it was a 603 or a 603E, these machines weren't the best. So the Power Mac 6200 series is the 6300, depending on the flavor that was sold. I think Ron has some choice words for this machine, don't you, Ron?
Yes, yeet this series of machines directly into the sun. It's I would say the only thing you might hang on to is a 4400 just for like kind of just of interest. It is just a weird
Yeah.
thing that Apple tried, but the rest of them are hot garbage. They are not great, and they have a lot of limitations, and they I mean are basically like the 6200 is like a Quadra level board that they shoehorned a 603 chip onto just to try to extend the life on using that case, because Apple had produced like a ton of those cases. So they absolutely wanted to be able to get clear out all their back stock, and they did. Not to customers' advantage, though. That's for sure.
Yeah, yeah, it's an odd duck. I mean, some people loathe these machines. Some people jokingly claim they're the best Macs ever made, but unless it's free on your doorstep or you're going to steal parts out of it, I'd pretty much avoid it. The 4400, also known as the 7220, I believe, in international markets,
Mhm.
was a very odd duck of a machine. We're not going to talk too much about Macintosh clones, but essentially there was a period of time where Apple let other manufacturers make Macs. And one of the ways they did that was providing them with parts like a logic board. And so this was Apple's attempt at making a cheap Mac clone. It's a metal case, very PC like. The floppy drive is on the left instead of the right. Cats and dogs living together, mass hysteria. So it's a bit of an odd machine there. Just like the others in the series, it uses a slower IDE or ATA hard disk. So you have that to worry about if you're trying to get one of these machines to run. I think that 4400 is a little bit less picky on the IDE drives. These used later chipsets, all these machines. So you're a bit better. The 6400 and 6500 tower are these weird behemoths of a tower with what looks like, a tooth on the top. It's this weird smooth rounded thing there. And what's interesting is you could actually find bezels that let you use a tape drive or a zip drive in there or something. They are a bit more expandable. Unfortunately, the hard drive is on the front of the machine, which means you have to bend off that very brittle front faceplate, which requires a lot of force to do. And I actually cracked mine while I removed it because the hard drive is on a sled right there. So unfortunately, those machines are a bit harder to get into. They do have a big subwoofer in them for whatever reason, so the sound is pretty good. The video connector is on the top left of the machine, and there's a little volume button there, a knob rather. So they're interesting, but again, I wouldn't go out of your way paying too much for these machines, with maybe the exception of the 4400 as an interesting piece of your collection, but they're not the best. They do have some of the video in and out or TV and FM tuner capabilities the previous Performas and Power Macs had as add-on cards. And if you're lucky, maybe one of the communication card slots will be filled up with the Ethernet card, but that's about it.
Yeah. And as if it couldn't get any worse, it's everything that you hate about those 603 base Power Macs, but now they have a built-in CRT. I don't know who I know who these machines are for. These machines were for education or for like a cheap office machine, but they are so heavily compromised in terms of performance. I remember I actually purchased one for a client way back in the day, and they called me and they said, "I think there's something wrong with the machine." And I said, "Well, I'm happy to come over and check it out," because I I worked for MicroAge at the time, and that was kind of our thing. So ran over there, took a look at it. I'm like, no, this is just kind of how it is. And they were like, we're not sure we're going to keep it. And I was like, okay, well, I'll try to see what I can do. But um, the one I sold came back, and I didn't recommend it to anybody else. I was like, call over and talk to Joe or so and so law office, and they'll give you an opinion on what they thought of this. Um, but they're so heavy, they're so brittle.
Yeah.
The base on the bottom that is required for the machine to kind of like rotate it, where you could kind of set the angle and all that. So that it's a neat idea that kind of builds on what they had done with the like the LC 475, or I'm sorry, LC 575 and all that. But it's so brittle. It's just terrible.
Yeah,
Some of them have AV capabilities. Some of them have networking and things like that built in. Uh, Not great. Not great. Wouldn't recommend buying one of these.
yeah. I have two of them. I think they're both the 5200 slash 75 LC models, which is like the
Mhm.
worst of the worst, I think.
Yeah.
Um, the good thing about these machines is the board does slide out the back, like the other all-in-one Macs that we've been talking about. So you can actually upgrade the logic board, or you could, put a IO card on there or something to give it a little bit of a better performance or different capabilities.
Mhm.
I think these machines also were compatible with a video mirroring card that Apple sold. So you can actually output the video signal to a projector or a bigger
Mhm.
TV screen or a
Yeah.
monitor or something that you may have had in your classroom.
Mhm.
But yeah, these are kind of compromised Macs. A lot of them were sold in education only situations. So, this was way before the iMac, and these machines were just a solution to have an all in one with a PowerPC processor. And at least they're not 601s, they're 603s. They're
Yeah.
okay, but you're not going to break any speed records with these machines. They may be convenient because they're an all in one. They have an
Mhm.
optical drive there, they have a floppy drive in there. A lot of these did sell with TV tuner and AV capability, so you have a remote control. But yeah, that's about it. I mean, the only thing I could think of to add to these all-in-one Macs is for the 550 models that perform a 500 series. There was actually a model that was selling without a CD-ROM drive, so you have a weird stripe of a bezel instead of a CD-ROM drive, and that just was like a lower cost option. I wouldn't be surprised if Apple considered doing that for this model too, because that's how cheap they wanted to sell them to
Yeah.
schools.
It's I mean, if you don't need a CD-ROM drive, it's not everybody's going to sit there and need to install software, run whatever, run some things off the network, or like at my school, we had an external SCSI CD-ROM drive that just got shared between devices. So just because it was just so expensive, so expensive. All right, Steve, we are getting we're getting there. We're almost
Yes.
there.
So the G3 desktop, this is the end all be all of the beige era of Macintosh computers. These were literally the last beige systems that Apple sold. So the Power Macintosh G3 desktop and the Mini Tower are two different systems. The one pictured here is the desktop. The Mini Tower is, well, a tower. It's similar size and shape to the 8600, 9600. It's a little shorter because it doesn't have many PCI card slots. There was a prototype with more of them in there, but Steve Jobs said, nope, we want to have this machine compromised for whatever reason. They are beasts of a machine. The G3 processor is really, really quick. They can run Mac OS 8 through Mac OS 9 and versions of Mac OS 10 as long as you have enough memory in them. They are nice because they have both onboard ATA IDE ports and SCSI ports. So you have a different array of hard disks and optical drives or zip drives that you plug into this machine. And they are the last Macs with a full array of legacy I/O ports. So you have ADB, you have serial built in, you have SCSI built in, and it's just another great example of a bridge machine to have, one of the fastest ones you could get. You could also upgrade the processor on these. There were some socket upgrades. The processor comes out in a little socket similar to Pentium PCs, and you could just put an upgrade card in there from Sonnet or Max Power, I think was another one. There's a lot of different upgrades that you could find online. Again, be prepared to pay a little bit higher prices for those. But these also had onboard ATI 3D Rage cards. They were just a chipset on board. There's a little VRAM module that you could actually install because I think it's 2 megabytes onboard of video, but you could upgrade that to 6 megabytes. So you could actually put in this little card and upgrade the video memory. It's not going to be the best gaming machine out there. You're going to want a dedicated PCI video card for that, but it does give you that option. These cards have an interesting, I'm sorry, these machines have an interesting option. They were called personality cards that Apple dubbed them. They're next to the PCI slot, and it gives you this expansion that Apple sold three different flavors to choose from. So the lowest end systems came with the audio only card, which I think was codenamed or nicknamed Whisper. And so that just gives you standard headphone and microphone in and out. This machine does not have audio other than that. It's only on that card. Um, and then there was this AV in and out card, which gave you composite video in and out, which was nice. But the last card was sort of an upgrade on that, and it had the necessary hardware to decode DVD playback. So, kind of a harder card to find if you want that ultimate G3. But then again, DVD playback back in the day was not even the best on this one. But again, came in beige for the desktop and mini tower. There is one machine that is not mentioned here, and just for kicks, I'll mention it. It's the G3 All-in-One, nicknamed the Molar Mac because it kind of looks like a tooth. It's this huge beige beast. It's actually bigger than the iMac. It's a 60-pound thing that is quite heavy, and it has the full logic board of the desktop or the mini tower inside of it. So you had full PCI expansion, released only a few months before the iMac G3. So not a lot of them, were selling because of the price point, and the speed of these machines and the bigger screen just really wasn't worth the extra money, because if you really needed expansion, you probably bought a desktop. One last thing to note about these systems: they are not the blue and white models you'll hear about online, or the B and W models. Those have a blue and white case reminiscent of the candy colored iMacs, which do not have any legacy IO except for the ADB port. So that's the way to tell these systems apart. If you see a G3 machine listed online, if it's beige, it's one of these. If it's not, it's something else.
Oh, oh, Steve, I'm exhausted.
Those past 8 hours just flew by.
I know. Oh my gosh. Uh, but this was the point in the presentation. We asked people to just kind of take a second and catch their breath and digest some of the information that had just been washed over them, and to think about what era of machine best speaks to them, and just you know to maybe think about where they're headed as a collector. So, Steve, if you have done some thinking about what type of machine you would collect, what would that machine be?
Yeah, so here are some of my favorites. The G3 beige mini tower. I got this even after I had an iBook G3. I wanted a desktop machine, and it was at the price point I could afford. They were pretty readily available. Plus the expandability of it. I ran OS 10 on there. I even put Linux on there at one point. They have multiple drive bays. You could put whatever you want in there. I had a zip disk drive in there at one point. Really great machine, very expandable. I love the darn thing, and it just looks really cool. The Power Macintosh 7500 was one of my family's machines growing up. It was just one of these systems that, again, had some great features. It had the AV in and out on it, so you could plug a VCR into it and watch TV and stuff like that. Also had a built-in CD-ROM as the G3 did, so it was great for multimedia titles and such. Now, the last one, if you know me, the family machine we had growing up was the Macintosh 2CX. But I put the 2CI here because if I'm going to recommend machines, it's not what I'm particularly partial to. It's what's going to be best for somebody who's new to collect them.
Hmm.
So the 2CX, as we mentioned before, does not have onboard video. The 2CI does. So it gives you a one little feature there that'll help you along in getting these machines running, because those new bus video cards can set you back at least, $40 or $50 depending on where you look.
Yep.
So those are my three picks of the machines to collect. There are plenty of other great ones to collect, but those are the three we limited ourselves to, at
Right.
least in my corner.
Yeah. I would say that if you are looking for a cheap color Macintosh, you might be able to pick up an LC3. That is, again, it's a 25 megahertz 68030, uses 32 pin RAM. It's a great candidate to drop a blue SCSI into. And basically, it is just a nice, fast, stable 68030 era machine. There's a lot of great software that you can run, System 7 software you can run on that guy. There's a real simple overclock you can do to make it kind of one of the better 030 machines out there. You can add an FPU. You can do so much to this thing for just kind of maybe an overlooked machine a little bit too. If that's not your speed, like a Macintosh SE30, if you can pick one up and you're willing to get it repaired and all that type of stuff, it is the ultimate black and white all-in-one Mac. I so many of my clients back in the day used those as servers, just because it was a cheap machine, and you could put it in a corner somewhere and just turn the monitor all the way down, and I didn't have to buy a big display. So a lot of people did the math, and it just made economic sense for them. And they're so iconic. There's so many cool things you can do with them. Lots of expansion. I mean, there's crazy stuff you can do with that. And then, of course, the Macintosh Quadra 700, just because of not really. Um, I liked it before then just because it was kind of a neat, small, it's the same size as 2V or 2CI, 2CX, Quadra level machine. A couple new bus slots, a PDS slot. You can drop the Apple DOS compatibility card in the PDS, and then there are adapters and stuff where you can kind of bridge to the back of the machine. There's so much fun stuff you can do with it. Tantalum caps. I mean, it's got so much going for it. So those are my three. Steve, tell me about the machines that you wouldn't pick.
Oh boy. Now this is hard because Ron knows that I have more Macs than I can shake a stick at. And I own all the machines that I'm telling you to avoid. But I'm going to be very specific for why. Although I love the 2SI, it's a great little machine, very attractive case, was the only one in that form factor. If I'm going to recommend that machine to somebody, I can't say that, hey, here, you're going to have a great time, because the power supply is going to have to be recapped. It's not an if. A lot of the times we're talking about capacitors in this presentation, they all need to be replaced at one point. Even the Power Macs will need to be replaced eventually. But the 2SI is notorious for whatever reason that power supply leaks, and you have to replace the capacitors in it. You have to clean it up,
Mhm.
and it's going to be a big job. The same goes to the logic board. For whatever reason, that one's very problematic as well. That's the exact reason why I'm not recommending the LC. Also, because it was the first in the series, and it's a 020 processor instead of the faster 030, marginally faster in the LC2. So the original LC, unless it's free or really cheap or it's in beautiful shape, I'd suggest you avoid it. The capacitors on the logic board will need to be replaced. You will also have to go ahead and probably recap the power supply. The same thing goes for the 6100 as far as what I would recommend for a starter Mac. While it's okay, I wouldn't overpay for one, and it has that, HDI 45 interconnect cable on there. Same with the 7100 and the 8100. First generation of Power Macs, probably a little sluggish for what you probably want to do with it. Again, if it's free and it has everything you need, great. If not, there are some compromises to that machine. Not a lot of expandability unless you get all these adapters. So I think that's something to keep in mind as you see these machines out there. Don't go after the first one that's priced appropriately, or the first one you see. If you want it for parts, or you want a world of pain, sure, go ahead and dive in rather to the world of recapping. Otherwise, you'll end up with those machines in a dump.
Yeah. My list, I would say maybe avoid the 2FX. Not that it's a bad machine, it's just that it's kind of a problematic machine. You need a lot of specialized stuff. You've got to have that special RAM. You've got to have that proper SCSI, terminators and everything like that to actually make it work. And then on top of that, it's really, really expensive for kind of you could buy a faster Mac for less money. I mean, unless you just had to have a 2FX, I would just avoid a 2FX. The Macintosh TV, just because the crazy expensive accessories that if you don't have doesn't really complete the look of the machine. The fact that it's got a super compromised motherboard, it's bad at being a Mac TV. There was one on display at the Weather Channel booth at VCF Midwest, and it was okay, but there ain't much you could do with it other than make it a television. And I cannot imagine spending that much on a television contemporary to when that machine came out. I'm not sure who it was for. I think it was just one of those things you put out there just for show. Avoid it. Performance 6200, fire every last one of them into the sun without exception. They are terrible machines. They are a waste of your money. They have weak power supplies, which are proprietary and weird compared to just every other Mac on the market. The IDE performance sucks. It's a Quadra 630 motherboard with a 603 shoehorned in. So this is like 6200, 6300. There's a bunch of machines in that series. They're all terrible. The plastics are so super brittle. Just avoid them. Uh, like we're do not do not want.
And why we have this at the very bottom here about anything with a color built-in CRT, it's just because the brittle plastics and the, ability to ship them and destroy them almost instantaneously. Although the color classics are great and they're very desirable, and the 575 machines are pretty nice too, you will have to worry about their analog boards, and you will have to worry about, shipping them or storing them or just the condition that they're in. I'm not saying don't get a color classic or don't get a LC575. You just have to be aware there are things you have to think about. Might not be the best for your first machine if you're just trying to test the waters and you're dump $300, $400 on a color classic, only to find that if you breathe on it, it looks at you funny and the plastics crack.
Yeah, not good, not good. Okay, so I've bought my classic Mac. I've got it all. I got it here. I've opened it up. I've done evaluated it. It's in relatively good condition. I've kind of done the basic stuff I need to do to get up and running. What type of upgrades should I be looking for?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Ron. There's so many things today that are available for these Macs to just make it easier for you to get it up and running, make it easier for you to do faster things or better things with the machine that were simply impossible back in the day or at least very expensive. So I'll cover the first one here, which is the Blue SCSI. And this is basically a hard drive replacement on a little PCB. You could see the picture of it on the right. That's one of the flavors of the Blue SCSI. There's a little SD card slot there for your micro SD card. And that's basically how this operates as a hard drive. It talks to the SCSI bus on your computer. You could have multiple disk images and partitions on this thing, so you could boot from system 6 or 7. You have it configured exactly the way you want. And the reason why I like this and the reason I see this promoted so much is because unlike some of the other SCSI replacement devices out there, which, all of them have their unique talents and things like that, this one is the easiest, I think, to get up and running. You don't have to have special formatting software. You don't have to go through and configure it, through a utility or be very careful with it. All you have to do is take a micro SD card, you format it, and you put a file on there, just like you would put a picture on an SD card or a document. And then all you have to do is make sure that's named the proper way. There are pre-built and pre-downloadable images that'll get you all up and running for your machine. There are easy programs to help you do that. And all you have to do is drag and drop that and you're good to go. Your Mac will be happy. It will boot from this device as if it thinks it's a real hard drive. There are programs like Disk Jockey on the Mac that'll help you do that a bit easier. And there's great resources there. So check out bluescsi.com. There are a few different sellers that provide this. You could either buy it pre-assembled so you don't have to worry about soldering, or if you like soldering and you like a bit of a challenge, you can actually get a kit, save a few dollars, and assemble it yourself. They do make a few different varieties. This one's the internal one that you see here. There is one that is available in some circles of a PowerBook edition, where you could actually use that on a PowerBook because the SCSI connector is different. And lastly, there's the DB25, which is an external model, and that you can plug into the back of your Mac. It might not be the fastest option for some cases, but it's sure very handy to have a external SCSI hard drive in the palm of your hand. The one thing I will just briefly mention is these devices power themselves off of termination power. Some Macs, like the Macintosh Plus and some other models, will need external power applied to this device to get them to work. You can use a micro USB cable, the micro B, I believe, USB cable to
Mhm.
plug in there to power it, or there's that little white connector on the right that you see. If you're doing this internal, it uses the same connector as like a floppy drive would on a PC. So that's a great option there to replace the spinning rust or the dead hard disk that's inside of your Mac.
You know how I feel about that term, Steven. But yeah, no, these are great replacements for mechanical hard drives. What I would definitely say is kind of one of the best use cases is with the external model, which is a fun case you can get when you order them from some of the people listed there. Um, you want to, you can put the Apple Legacy Software Recovery CD on there. And I mean, that lets you install up to like OS 8 on just a ton of really old Macs, or use your bridge machine to make floppies for just a ton of other machines that don't maybe necessarily support SCSI or won't support the operating system that's on that bootable CD. But I mean, it's been so great because I've got one of those, and I've got like a partition set up where it's just like, oh, here's a drive file that has the recovery CD. Here's a drive file that has all my games. Here's a one that's got all my apps. Here's one that's got stuff specifically for my Apple IIe card or my DOS compatibility card. And you can just swap and move things around. And it's just so convenient. I mean, there was a time where this was solutions like this weren't out there, and it was just such a pain. It was so limiting for people to try to figure this out. It just, I'm so glad it's here now. It's so great.
It's the tool I use when I'm trying to diagnose a Mac. You just boot it up. You don't have to worry about things. I still find myself going to the old methods of, oh, I need a floppy disk so I could format this SCSI drive so I could then boot. And I'm like, wait a second, this is much easier.
I know there's modern solutions. I know I've done it the old way enough. I've put my time in. I just want to do it the easy way now. But if I could take two of these, because they're kind of actually related, Silicon Insider and Drake, who works with other folks, and it's the Satanic Mac Club, uh, which it's not as nefarious as it may sound to some folks, but
It's just a bunch of cute little drawings. They're great.
yeah, absolutely. But the Silicon Insider is based in France and designs all these neat like things. Like these are VRAM replacements for kind of the expensive original Apple modules. He also has uh, ROM replacements and stuff. So you think about you can replace the ROM on like an SE30 and make it boot faster and have some utilities and stuff built in. RAM upgrades for PowerBooks. Things that Apple never actually came out with, like an FPU card for the Classic Color or the Classic 2. So I mean, there's a lot of neat stuff that he's doing. Related to that, Drake also does a lot of those similar devices. He's based here, or I'm sorry, he's based in Canada. So wherever you're from, he might be based in your country of origin, um, but he makes some really neat VRAM modules, and these are all for the kind of use in conjunction with some overclocking products that just kind of came out for some of those Quadras. That's the Spicy O'Clock that you can overclock your Quadra machines. So the VRAM on those, or I'm sorry, the chips on those VRAM modules are absolutely, clocked a lot faster. So that way that you can overclock those machines even more. But lots of neat things. He also sells Blue SCSI and some other stuff. But
Yeah, no, those are great. And these are again great upgrades and replacements for things that are either very hard to find these days or that command a high price or just never existed.
right.
Now, our mutual friend Joe, who
Mm-hmm.
loves beige Macintosh computers and
Loves.
repairing them, loves them. He actually went the extra mile and actually built some really cool 3D printed replacement parts for some of these brittle plastic Macs that we've been talking about. Little plastic doors and port covers for like the Color Classic and the 500 series, and also his own creation, Neethernet, which was a local talk replacement that uses modern components and cables. He did a whole video about it for the Macintosh event. We'll put a link in the video description here. But you can go to his store there, jcm-1.com. There's a lot of great stuff there to buy. There's also some merch and fun stuff there. So Joe's a great asset to the Macintosh community, and he's always working on these other cool projects with other people and collaborating with them. So if you see his name and you see his YouTube channel, that's the guy.
Yeah.
Oh boy, cap kits. I'll talk a little bit about this. So cap kits are the necessary evil to recap your Mac. And You can probably get away with buying components individually on a place like DigiKey or Mouser if you know exactly what you're looking for and you have the part number. But generally, for logic boards, you could get away with that. But for analog boards, it's a bit different. Those capacitors usually command a bit of a higher price, and you're gonna find yourself in the hole pretty quickly. Whereas with Console 5, they order these things in such a bulk that they could pass a reasonable savings on to you. So, for example, they have kits that you could just buy and just buy one thing, add it to your cart, and that's all the caps you need for that project. Whether it be for a logic board or a analog board for, let's say, a classic or a color classic or a Mac Plus. I just want to stress that there are many variations on power supplies, analog boards, and even logic boards. So you want to make sure that you have the correct model, and you want to make sure you are buying for the correct model. Otherwise, you'll find that that kit might not do you so good. Two sites that I want to mention: recapamac.com and mac84.net/guides. That will bring you to recapping guide websites. Bruce at Brankus Creations runs the Recap a Mac site. And what's great about that is he has detailed recapping guides for pretty much every Macintosh computer that was released. So if you go to recapamac.com or recapamac.com.au, you'll find his website. All you have to do is use the little drop down selection under resources, and your guides will be right there. Some of the power supplies and analog boards he mentions are the international version. So if you are looking for a guide on the US, you might just have to go to mac84.net, or you just have to find another resource. But there are some great websites out there that tell you what caps you need for what systems. And again, just be mindful, there are different revisions and things out there you should be aware of. But Console 5 also does stuff for video games and other systems too, not just Apple stuff, not just Mac stuff. So they're a great resource to go to if you need a cap kit for your Mac, but you don't want to have to measure each little capacitor and see each value that your system needed.
When we talked about earlier about how to get software onto some of these old machines, the floppy emu by Big Mess of Wires is a very handy solution. You can kind of see it in the screenshot there too, but that's more like an Apple II screenshot. So I thought I'd show the Mac, the kind of the like one I have configured for Mac, even though they're identical. You can use it on both. But it's a very nice solution, especially for those floppy based Macs. If you don't want to get a hard drive or and make investments in those type of things, you can use the floppy emu. Just use an SD card. You can load it up with all of your software. You go through the menu, you select what you want. Basically, that is the virtualized disk image that gets exposed to the Macintosh or the Apple II computer that you're using. And from there, you can just run your software, and it's very convenient and it's very fast, or at least as fast as a floppy drive is. So I would highly recommend those, a device like that, especially for like a 128, 512, even I mean, even up to the Plus, because when the Plus came out, the SCSI standard was still being formed. So there are it's kind of slow. And I remember back in the day, you even had to do what they called interleaving, where basically it was telling the drive that it had to spin so many times before it could read information. And it's just a headache. But a floppy drive, it's fine. It's a very walled garden, so it's very convenient. So I would definitely recommend a floppy emu.
Yeah, and you could actually order a package that comes with a little adapter on the end of the board. So the floppy emu, whatever you prefer, however you celebrate it, you can plug that in either internally to the port that your floppy drive will plug into, or the device that Ron was just holding up converts that to the external floppy port that was on some of the early Macintosh II series, some of the compact Macs, and like an Apple IIc or something like that, because the device does work with Apple systems. Just the flash the firmware, it's easy enough to do. But
Yeah,
a great device to have in your toolkit, especially if you don't have a Mac that has a SCSI port on it.
absolutely.
So the raw SCSI Reloaded is the new name for this project. And the raw SCSI is very interesting. What they have done is they're using a Raspberry Pi computer, and you could use a few different models like a Raspberry Pi Model 2, etc. But essentially, what you can do is get this little add on board. And again, you could solder it yourself via a kit you order, or you could buy it pre assembled. And this plugs into the GPIO header on the Raspberry Pi. And it basically makes it a very cool and very smart wireless or wired connected SCSI hard disk. And what's nice about that is since it's wired or wireless to your network, you have this little web page administration feature where you could actually go in and you could mount devices. You could download files directly from the internet to a disk image. You can do crazy things like have multiple things mounted at once. You could just go to that page and configure it while the machine is on and up and running, which takes a lot of the hassle out of booting some of these Macs because you don't have to worry really about SCSI IDs or anything like that. The configuration is very simple on the web page to figure that out and to set this thing up to how you'd like it. You could also use some of those features to get your machine online. So there's some experimental features which allows the ROS SCSI to act as a SCSI to Ethernet bridge. So let's say your Macintosh Plus or your Macintosh Classic, or you don't have the hard to find adapter for the Macintosh SE30, you can actually get them online or connected to your local Ethernet network or anything like that with one of these ROS SCSIs with that experimental software. It's come a long way. I did a video on it a bit ago, but the way to use this functionality is a bit easier. So I would check out the GitHub page there. They also have a great Discord channel that will link below, along with the Blue SCSI folks, where you could ask questions or see some of the functionality. But it does cost a little more to get into because you need a Raspberry Pi, you need a power adapter for that. But the ROS SCSI is a great option. It's very flexible, and I think a lot more people will like that creativity that you could get with just configuring it wirelessly, uploading some disk images to there, downloading stuff directly to the machine. And it's very exciting to have these options, without worrying about old spinning hard disks and their eventual death.
Certainly. It's kind of unobtainium right now just because of the Raspberry Pi aspect of it, but it is a great product. Um, I definitely thought that it was important that we make mention of Mark from Mac Effects. Mark was at VCF Midwest along with his partner, and they were showing off all their whole brand new series of color Macintosh and Apple II cases. They have some that are just like tinted plastic. They have some that are completely clear. You really just have to go out to the website and kind of see it for yourself, and see if it appeals to you. But there are some people that are like, hey, there's so much interesting things going on inside these boxes. Wouldn't it be neat if you could see it from the outside? So definitely check out maceffects.com to see some of
Certainly.
those cool new cases.
They also sell little upgrades and things to your Macs, especially if you're going to get one of these older machines that, let's say, the floppy drive is worn out, it's not ejecting the disks. They have replacement little, very high quality created gears that are the best I've ever seen and used that replace the floppy gear that has been stripped away or broken away in your Mac. They also sell feet for your Power Mac, Quadra, and Centris pizza box. Those are the 6100 or 610 series. They're also selling little speakers and nameplates and memory upgrades and serial upgrades, or even whole logic boards like the Macintosh Classic Reloaded project. So check out the website. There's just plenty more to look at, and Mark's a great guy, and the stuff that he creates for us and our crazy compatriots who love these machines is just phenomenal. And he periodically runs Kickstarts as well. So if you can't wait to get on that, be sure to check out the website and you'll see more about that.
Absolutely. So, if you would like to learn more about some of the things that we spoke on tonight, you can definitely go to some of the URLs here. Applehistory.com very much kind of gives you kind of a retelling of some of the machines and the stories about Apple kind of coming along. Tinker Different is a great web forum where you can go out there and ask questions, talk to other enthusiasts, kind of buff up your knowledge on various things, and try to maybe work through like some technical questions and stuff with the team. Very nice folks. It's well worth checking out. MacintoshGarden.org. That is a website, abandonware website, where you can go out there and you can download software for your classic Macs. That's like one of the places where you can get that off, or that Apple software, or Apple Legacy Software Recovery CD. It's a mouthful, for restoring some of those old Macs, plus games and other things like that. It's really cool. Don't forget to check out Andy Hertzfeld's website, folklore.org, which has great stories about Apple back in the day. You can kind of learn more about the early days of Apple and hear funny stories about, pineapple pizza, and Burrell, or Andy Burrell, saying like, I'll be your best friend. I'll be your best friend. It's anytime you wanted a favor, I'll be your best friend.
Yeah, there are
And
some gems in that collection. Yeah.
absolutely. I've done a couple of videos where it was like, I've just done VO of some of the stories and stuff. And I just love it. I love that website. And then he also released a book that kind of catalogs and adds a little bit to some of those too. And then lowendmac.com is a great place you can kind of go and see specs on different machines. And they've got their own picks for the best and worst machines to kind of look out for. Just a real treasure trove of information. They also have a Facebook page, if you're into the Book of Faces, where you can interact with people and learn more out there too.
Yeah, what's great about Low End Mac is there's a lot of articles and things that they've written over the years, which are sort of go-to sources for either telling you the difference between machines or understanding if it's worth it to do a software update, or just going into the weeds of this stuff and bringing more information to light. So
Mhm.
that's definitely a website you should check out.
Yeah. And don't forget, you can also go to mac84.net/web/getting started with vintage Macs. Better URL coming soon. Uh, where you
We'll put a
can,
link below. You don't
don't
have to type
worry,
the whole
it'll be
thing.
in the doobly doo. You don't have to remember it. But yeah, that'll kind of archive some of these links and stuff as well, and some additional things as Steve and I work on this series and add stuff to it, that hopefully you will find entertaining and informational. So we did have we ran short of time on the real version of this talk. And so we basically just fast forward and went straight to our giveaway and then got out of there. So we didn't encroach on the group that was coming in after us. But Steve, did we get a question? Because we kind of put the word out there. Even if we didn't, it's okay, because people can always ask questions in the comments, and Steve and I'll monitor
Yes.
that and answer those things
And if we're
cheerfully.
too slow to do that, because we're a bunch of old folks here, you can go to tinkerdifferent.com and post a thread, or go to the Facebook groups that we were talking about before. Low End Mac, Vintage Apple Macintosh Enthusiasts is another one. These are great groups with thousands of members
Hmm.
where they will answer your questions. They have a lot of experience, just like Ron and myself here, to sort of guide you in the right direction. But I think a question that I hear most often about collecting these machines is sort of, where do I start? And I'd just like to say, you have to think about what you want to do with that machine, what type of software you want to run, what type of operating system does that require. And that sort of answers the question, well, do I need a 68K Mac or a Power PC or an Intel Mac or whatever? Because that's sort of put you into that mindset of, what do I have to do? Because there are a lot of different games and software pieces out there. Look at the system requirements and try and figure that out. Or a good point would also to be, go to archive.org and look up some of the Macintosh magazines back in the day, Macworld, Mac Addict, etc., to try and get an understanding of what was going on or what software was cool to try out, to sort of get in that mindset. And another resource I would say on archive.org is a lot of the books that are scanned in, either the product guides or product manuals from Apple, or some of the how to or dummies guides back in the day. A lot of those you could borrow or download a PDF of, and it really, puts you in the mindset of how to use the Mac OS if you're not familiar with it at all. And those guides are very, very helpful. Don't overlook Apple's own documentation either, because some of that stuff is just written from a great point of view where anybody could pick up and learn about it.
Absolutely, absolutely, well said. Um, wow, this was quite a bit of information to absorb. I hope that
Yes.
people had a good time with us, as much of a good time as we had discussing it with you. Now, just in to give the full experience, we did a giveaway at VCF Midwest. We gave away a couple of machines and a book. And if you follow this QR code, it will take you to a fun video where, if you are an old time Macintosh person, it will be a blast from the past, hopefully.
Yeah, that's that's going to give Ron some good views. So please click on that and get that QR code. Do what you have to do for that to get that working. But there are plenty of resources that we mentioned today. Plenty of links. We'll put them all in the video description, and you'll be able to get started with your Macintosh collecting, because there's no better time to start. All the information that we provided you hopefully gives you a leg up, and there are so many machines to choose from that hopefully this gives you a bit of a better understanding of what to go for and what not to go for. A lot of these machines can be very pricey. I am putting together a better price guide to sort of walk you through that. And there's a lot of great places like Tinker Different or the Facebook groups that we mentioned that will help price check you to say, well, that's a good deal or that's not a good deal. There's also a vintage Apple subreddit that you should check out. So a lot of these great communities to sort of see if you're on the right track to collecting something. Don't overpay. There's plenty of them out there.
Hmm.
And if you run into a problem, let somebody know. Hopefully, we could turn you in the right direction.
Right. Apple produced these units in the millions. So there's a lot of them that are still out there. It may be oh, I live in the part of the world where Macintosh portables never come up. And it's like, well, it's kind of a rare machine. So maybe you know what your budget is. But forewarned is forearmed. So if you know the things you're looking out for, hopefully you can be a more informed consumer and not get taken advantage of by somebody that's like, I know what I've got. I know what this is worth. And it's
That Centris 610. I want $1 billion for it.
I'm sure people in hell want ice water, but I just can't do it. So oh, well, this was a lot of fun. I can't wait to do future installments, Steve. We'll have to see if the interest strikes us to do a version kind of on those early iMac, the iMac era, and all that.
Yeah,
And
power books and stuff like that. And
yeah,
please leave a comment below if you want to see us cover a different topic of Apple collecting or something related to that. You have to leave a comment. You have to like the video, share it with your friends on Twitter or Discord or Facebook or whatever you
yeah,
use. Let the
mhm,
word out there, get out there rather, that,
yeah.
there's this great video that's, only about 8 hours long that gives you all you
Only
need to know about collecting Macs.
here's the
It's a
thing.
small price to pay. We,
Yeah,
we spent our whole lives figuring out this stuff, and we're presenting it to you free. You only have to donate 5 easy payments of $9.99.95 to Ron's Computer Videos Patreon. That's
oh
all.
gosh, I don't think you have to go that far, but I would definitely say that if this seems like a lot of video to watch, just do it like a Mac 84 live stream replay. You put it on at 2x. Steve doesn't know the difference, and you still get all the information, chipmunk style. Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah. Steve, thanks so much for taking time out of your evening to have this little chat with me and with our friends out in internet land.
Yeah, you're welcome, Ron. Thank you so much for including me in your presentation at VCF Midwest. And it was a pleasure to do a deeper dive here with more information without a time constraint to really give the details. It is a long video, but I think it's very important to cover a lot of the aspects that we didn't have time to cover. So thank you so much
Absolutely.
for having me.
Yeah, thank you again. And again, thanks everybody at home for spending your evening with us, or afternoon, or lunch break, whatever. Probably should get back to work. So anyway, thank you so much. Everybody have a wonderful evening. Remember, Apple II forever.
Apple III forever.
Steve.